Tuesday, June 25. This is a regular meeting, and we were in closed session. And I'd just like to ask the city manager to share.
Thank you, Mayor, Agramonte, and council members. And we were in closed session, and council gave us direction, but there is no report out at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to called the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask for the Pledge of Allegiance, but I'm going to do this because this is such an exciting night. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Can I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Cook?
Here.
Councilmember Henley?
Here.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Here.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Here.
Thank you.
Could I have approval of the agenda, please?
Make a motion to approve the agenda. I'll second that.
Roll call, please.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. And let's see. I think I'll read the public comments at this time. So, comments from the public. At this time, they're saying they don't hear any of us. At this time, members of the public may comment on any item not appearing on the agenda. It is recommended that you keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Under state law, unless otherwise permitted under the Ralph M. Brown Act, the merits of the matters presented under this item cannot be discussed or acted upon by the City Council at this time. For items appearing on the agenda, the public will be invited to make comments at the time the item comes up for the council consideration. Upon being acknowledged by the mayor, please step to the podium and speak into the microphone. Begin by stating and spelling your name.
Ken Brown, BROWN, 1396 Lubeck Street, Sonoma. My main mission this evening is support one of the citizens that will speak in a little while, David Keller. I want to focus on unjust evictions and rent control. Some of you are renters. I think all of you understand the feeling, and we'd love to see it on the agenda. In regards to our president, I'm a first-generation American. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I have served my country here in Sonoma and abroad. I'm a father of 4 children. I take that job really seriously, Gary, really seriously, like you do. This Saturday at the library, 755 West Napa Street, there is a cannabis meeting. It's a wonderful place to meet, 4 to 5:30. I hope you show up, learn something. 10 o'clock in the morning in the plaza is another rally. Bless you. I'll be there.
God bless you.
And many other Sonomans will be there. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is David Kendall, Kendall. I live at 80 Woodworth Lane, and I'm a member of the Spiritual Action Group of the Sonoma United Methodist Church and the Sonoma Valley Housing Group that we're part of. One of our main issues has been the declining numbers of working-class families in Sonoma and the Sonoma Valley. The main motivator of this decline is housing costs. I moved here in summer of 2016 from Eureka to pursue a job offer. and I was pleasantly surprised to find a peaceful culture and environment in which families can thrive. During the fires, I witnessed a fantastic community response and outpouring of support for affected Sonoma families. This demonstration fortified my faith in this community. What I see today is shattering that faith. Families are moving out. My elementary school-age children are losing friends to a cost of living that after the fires has graduated from exorbitant to prohibitive. The folks who are not moving are discussing it as an option. Many are people who are raised here themselves, and new young families are not moving in from what I can see. My landlord recently told me that he was raising my rent 12.5%. When I suggested that he was in conflict with price gouging laws, he replied that he did not raise the rent last year. 2 weeks later, he sent me a notice to vacate. I have spoken with an attorney, and I feel that I have little chance of legal recourse or of finding a rental property for my family at a comparable rate. I expect that the property will rent at a 25% increase over what I am currently paying. I have a good job and a marketable skill set. I can go anywhere in California and earn a comparable wage. I choose to live in Sonoma, despite the high cost of living and the lack of any foreseeable path to homeownership, because my kids like it here. But my kids won't like it here if all of their friends move away. And I won't either. And I probably won't stay if that happens. Diversity equals value. Maybe some folks will enjoy it here, but I doubt it. My prayer is for stabilization of the rental market. I would like to see limits on landlords' ability to displace tenants on a whim. It seems appropriate for towns affected by the housing shortage to keep closer tabs on the rental market in order to protect the elderly, working class, and minority populations from gentrification tactics. My family will be okay in this instance. The rent increase is annoying, being asked to move is annoying, and being pushed around and feeling like I have no right or recourse is annoying. But I feel that it is still worth all of this annoyance to live in Sonoma because my kids are happy here. For now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall.
I'm Dave Ransom. I live in Santa Rosa. I go to church in Sonoma at the Sonoma United Methodist Church. I'd like to second David's thoughts. When he came to Spiritual Action 2 Sundays ago and told us he was being evicted, I started to think about the problems people in our group face. 2 are living in a barn. 1 has had one landlord after another raise the rent or throw them out. 2 are on Section 8 and terrified it will end somehow. At least 1 is living in a granny unit, and 3 of us have had serial homeless friends crashing with us, sometimes a bunch at a time. I had good fortune to meet Saturday with some young people who came together after the fire to help the Springs community recover. They grew up here. Most of them can't live here anymore because of the high cost of housing. The fellow who's leading the group, who grew up here, said the last time he lived in Sonoma, he was paying hundreds of dollars for an attic room where he couldn't stand up. So much for the good news. Now for the bad news. As you know, the wine grape growers on the Farm Bureau and the bigger business interests in the Sonoma County Alliance have put the kibosh on the affordable housing bond that had been bruited about by the county. Last week, the executive director of the Alliance wrote in the Press Democrat that they were against any tax for affordable housing, whether bond or sales tax. And as you have probably guessed, I spend much of my day reading horror stories. Last week about armed men tearing children from their parents' arms. Another one came in today. The average family in Silicon Valley puts more than half their gross income into their mortgage payment, which is 3 times the national average. Our housing prices are part of the spillover, and polls show half of the young people in the Bay Area are planning to leave in the next 3 years. That's part of the spillover. And the fact that so many of us lay all out at the feet of local government is part of the spillover. But what the heck can you guys do? As a short-term make-do, you could pass local rent control and just cause eviction ordinance. You could endorse the Affordable Housing Act on the November ballot to repeal Costa-Hawkins, the law that hamstrings local government's ability to enact the comprehensive rent control. Longer term, you could work in the League of California Cities to create a united front for getting state money for housing. But all of these are going to go over much better if you build an educated support movement by organizing and leading the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Patricia Cullinan, 425 Denmark. I'd like to report on Pueblo Day and thank the City Council for waiving the plaza use fee. We had a very successful day considering it was 102, which kind of discouraged people, and a NASCAR weekend, which discouraged others. We had a variety of attendees from outside of the area and beyond the state. I think that was really great, and everyone was excited about the displays, and the state allowed us to open the Blue Wing Inn. And just following up on Ken Brown's comment, I'm a first-generation American also. My dad escaped Southeast Asia in World War II.
Thank you, Ms. Cullinan.
Good evening, Council. I'm Fred Allebach at 19550 8th Street East, and I would like to stand in support of David Kendall. And I'm also from the Sonoma Valley Housing Group, and I've been attending there for years, and I'm a renter here in the community. I don't live in the city, but the city is my center of gravity. This is my urban area, and I don't really quite know what to say. I've watched the housing crisis unfold gradually since the 2008 real estate bubble, and I just really like to ask the council to try to find something to do. I've heard people, make suggestions, and I've seen various reports that the city is satisfying its regional housing needs assessment, but that doesn't include on the graphs the people who are getting externalized out of the community. And I think that it's highly likely that I'm going to join those ranks, so I'm going to enjoy my time here in the community and doing the things that I do, and it's been fun. And I've been to other places like Vallejo, and I've seen somebody get attacked by pit bulls on the street and come back to Sonoma and said, well, it's not really that bad to be arguing about pink doors and being part of a face-to-face community, because these are first world problems that we have. And but the first world problems, first world people need second world and third world people to work for them. And that's who I am. I'm a blue collar worker, and I enjoy it. I like my lifestyle. I like being my own boss, and I like working for the clients that I have here in Sonoma. It's really pleasant. It's great. I love my commute. Sometimes on the east side, I commute 2 minutes from my house. And I've enjoyed the community a lot, and I think a lot of other people have, like David. And I think that we add to the community, people who aren't homeowners, or people who are just kind of salt of the earth, or people who work with their hands for a living. So I'd just like to ask you to go ahead and get the in lieu fees done and do them high. Get more TOT, dedicate the TOT to housing. Get that $1 million out of the reserve fund for housing. Do something bold and go for it, because otherwise we'll just be gone. So hope you do something. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allbeck.
Good evening, Council. Larry Barnett, 637 5th Street East. I appreciated the mayor reading the comment statement at the beginning of the meeting about the public comment period, and I'm here to talk about the 3-minute rule. You will notice, as the mayor most graciously pronounced, that it is recommended to keep your comments to 3 minutes. It doesn't say required. It doesn't say prohibited. It doesn't say demanded. It just says recommended. It's polite. It's a nice, polite, kindly approach to an issue of whether or not it's necessary to cut someone off mid-sentence while they have something to say. Now, why do we have public meetings and why even have public comment? If it's going to become some kind of rigid adherence to the rules, all it's doing is discouraging exactly what you want. Unlike myself, who've had many years standing and addressing the public or others, many people don't have that experience. They're uncomfortable, they're nervous, it's difficult, and this little clock up here with the lights flashing doesn't make it any easier. We thought about doing it in the 12 years I was on the council, and we rejected it. And we never had this system. Now, particularly on a night like tonight, where you have almost nobody here, and let's be honest, most of your council meetings have very few people who are here to speak on certain subjects. Obviously, having the timer and having a 3-minute rule makes sense if you have a busy, controversial public hearing. But if you've got a budget hearing and you limit people to 3 minutes, or an agenda which is largely budget items, where the agenda packet itself is hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and you expect to get some sort of rational help and assistance, good, creative, important possibly views from the public about how to deal with the most important thing on the city agenda, holding people to 3 minutes after they've gone through hundreds and hundreds of pages? I just don't get it. And I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's kind. I think the public is looking to be respected. They want to be appreciated, they want to feel like they matter and they have value. And the 3-minute rule runs counter to that. It just isn't necessary in a town this size where, frankly, 90% of the people to come up to speak could all call you by first name and vice versa. We've done it in the past that way. There's absolutely no reason why we couldn't revert to that. I think it's well within the purview of the chair of the meeting to say, you know what, tonight I'm going to suspend the 3-minute rule, and I'm going to tell people to wrap it up when I think they've gone on too long. That's the way we used to do it, and that's the way the mayor could do it going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barnett. Is there anyone else who would like to approach the podium? Having none, I'm closing the public session, and we're moving on to consent calendar. I'll read. Pardon? Oh, right. I'm sorry. Do we have any dedications this evening? None. Thank you. That's a good thing, actually, when you think about it. What I'll do is I'll read the consent agenda, and then you can continue on with public hearing. I'm doing something, I have lots of energy tonight, so I'm trying to use it up. All items listed on the consent agenda are considered to be routine and will be acted upon by a single motion. There will be no separate discussion of these issues unless members of the council, staff, or public request specific items to be removed for separate action. At this time, council may decide to change the order of the agenda. Does anyone wish to do that? Well, I'll take it out to the public to see if they would like to do anything, they'd like to pull something, or?
Yes, I would like to have item 4.4 regarding the cost allocation plan considered separately, please.
Thank you. And the council, what is your pleasure? What would you, to approve 4.1, 2, and 3.
I'd like to make a motion to approve 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3.
Second.
Second. May I have a roll call on that, please?
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
The motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. And Mr. Barnett has asked that this number be pulled, and I would imagine you would like to speak on that issue. And do you have any questions for the city manager? Yeah.
I don't specifically have some questions. Okay. Is there going to be a staff report
Yes.
before public comment?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Mayor, council members, as you are aware, we had a public study session on the cost allocation plan on June 4th. With us in the audience is Courtney Ramos with Matrix Consulting, who is the consultant that we hired to do the cost allocation plan. The purpose of a cost allocation plan, this is a kind of a best practice tool that's used by cities across the nation. And what it does basically is you step back and you look at your costs and you determine what your basic indirect costs would be. If you think about a city, there are cities that there are departments that provide direct services to citizens: police, fire, public works, planning. And then there are those central services: legal, HR, city manager's office, finance, that we provide some direct services, but we're also providing support to those line departments. What the cost allocation plan is basically through a methodology, and we can have Ms. Ramos explain that. Basically goes through a methodology where we take those central service costs and, based on a variety of different mechanisms that align with the type of work that's being done by those central service departments, those costs are then charged out to the line departments. So think of those as a way to determine what your indirect cost. Part of the process of doing this was initially within our water rate study, we had a city overhead charge, and going back through the years, there was not kind of an analysis of where that had been done. I'm sure there was one at some point, but we were unable to find that. So part of the rationale of doing the cost allocation plan was to have a rigorous, transparent process, to be clear and to look at that. And so part of this process did look at those indirect costs as well. And there's kind of a realignment. So rather than, for example, city manager's office or finance, the staff charging their time directly, for example, to a department or to the water utility, now those costs come back to the main department, to the central services department, and they get charged out through an indirect process. So that's kind of a basic overview. Again, be happy to answer here public comment, any questions from the public, and Ms. Ramos is here as well. The only change that we made to the report, since you all saw about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a question from the public wanting just to be able to tie the fiscal year 17-18 budget. So we added some pages just so you could kind of really jump and see, here was the 17-18 budget, here were some of the other kind of policy changes that occurred, so you could tie those numbers and understand, really kind of follow all the numbers within the cost allocation plan. So with that, happy to answer any questions and be happy to pull up Ms. Ramos and her expertise as well.
All right, how about we have Ms. Ramos come up? I think that was the intention anyway, is that right?
She is here to answer questions. She's here, actually here on another agenda item a little later as well. It might be interesting to hear the questions of the public, and then Ms. Ramos can maybe add a little more unless council has any questions.
Yeah, I could. How about the council? Do you have any questions? None? So I'd like to take it back out to the public if you have any questions regarding this.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I came at this after basically 43 years in business for myself. And some of that was corporate business, companies I started. Some of it was smaller businesses, like when I had a 6-room B&B here in town. But a basic underlying principle of cost allocation and therefore the accordingly financial forecasts associated with it was tracking actually what people did and how they spent their time. Now, years ago, when we had a different city manager, I went into that office and I said, can you call up the Public Works Department head, have him bring the log book and some timesheets, because I want to find out how long it takes to put in a stop sign. And he said, well, no, I can't do that. And I said, why not? He said, well, there is no log book like that. And we don't keep those kind of timesheets. I said, okay, well, that's interesting. How is it that when you come up with your budget and you make certain assumptions each year about how many stop signs you're going to put in, how do you figure how much that's going to cost? Well, you know, the manager of that department has a general sense of how long it takes, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, but doesn't the accuracy of your forecast depend on some measure of actual productivity standards that the city has tracked and analyzed so that this is real data and not some kind of abstract notion? And he leaned back in his chair and he said, well, he said, that would be good. He said, but we're a monopoly. and he got a big smile on his face. And what that was an indication to me is that government doesn't have to operate by the same kind of standards that a more competitive marketplace has to work with. And I understand that government isn't a business, and I wouldn't want to see it as a business. But I do feel there is a difference between qualitative and quantitative data based on reality as opposed to some abstract notion of an allocation by percentage of personnel. Now, this is fine when it comes to buildings and things like that, where you're looking at square footage and what percentage of the total workload that a building might require of a department. But it makes no sense to me when it comes to individual personnel, because individual personnel are actually spending their time doing things, and that comprises 75% of the city's budget. So what we're saying here is that 75% of the city budget isn't based, as far as I can tell from looking at the 114 pages that I reviewed on this item. I didn't see anything in there about actual cost tracking. What does an employee in the Public Works Department do on a Tuesday? How many hours did he spend on Water Department work doing what? And how many hours did he spend on park maintenance doing what? I mean, we used to call these things time cards and time sheets and records, and I had to do it when I was going to bill my clients, but the city doesn't have to do it to basically bill the taxpayer. And there's something wrong about the whole thing. It strikes me as a great bureaucratic concept that government has widely adopted that actually doesn't relate to the real world particularly well. And unless someone can show me those timesheets, I'm not going to believe that this is going to be very helpful to the city. Thank you.
I wasn't going to speak on this, Patricia Cullinan, 425 Denmark, but this is an analogy. State parks, as you know, had a lot of problems a few years ago where they closed parks. They were doing exactly the same thing that you're describing, or Larry was describing. Bechtel and Hewlett-Packard and some large corporations went in, and they've changed the culture in state parks through a Parks Forward program. And I actually went to the hearings where they were explaining their bookkeeping, or lack thereof. Park superintendents couldn't tell you how much it costs to run a park unit, and now they can. And I think that that was something that was implemented that is it's a great help to the organization, whether it be the city or the state parks.
Thank you, Ms. Cullinan.
Hi, my name is David Kendall. I would like to speak in support of the point that Mr. Barnett just made regarding an accounting of activities of public employees. I see on the regular calendar there's a proposed change in planning fees with a shift to deposit-based cost recovery. And as a person who works regularly with planning agencies all over the state, I can say that the ones that I can understand the appeal of a cost recovery-based system. I will attest that it is extremely frustrating to get a bill from one of these agencies with no account of what exactly they spent all of the costs that they are trying to recover on. So it's extremely important, especially in this instance, to have some idea of what public employees are doing and some accountability to the people that are being served. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall.
Good evening, Council. Chris Petlock, 426 Napa Road, Sonoma. I posed some of these questions regarding the initial rate study not tying back to the budget, and I do appreciate the letter I received earlier this week and the updated cost allocation study. It's very helpful to be able to, at least for me and the way I think, to be able to look at something and it ties to other things. In this study, we can argue about methodology forever, but, I've been doing this for 25 years or so with private corporations, small businesses, professional services firms, and municipalities. And every one of them that we do any sort of billing out or any of that, it's all done through time tracking. This cost allocation study just doesn't really do that at all. The other concern I have is that it's based on a budget, and that was based on a budget that was really kind of based on the previous year's budget without much actual financial information when that budget was compiled. You know, even after all of this was done, at least we can see what the plug numbers are that work between last year's budget, this cost allocation study, and the proposed budget for what looks like the upcoming year. One of the areas that I looked at that really is troubling and really kind of leaves things hanging out there is if you go to page 37 of the proposed budget for this year, you'll see basically how many full-time equivalent employees work in each department. You start dividing that into the various budgets, departments, it doesn't make any sense. At first I thought, well, maybe the departments are a little light, but I think it's the other way. I think there's too many people stacked up in these. Anyway, it just doesn't make any sense. And everything's based on this. You go back to the water rate studies, which we're looking at a compounded 50% increase for people over the next 5 years. It's already among the highest water rates in the Bay Area. It's just very difficult to see that. The upcoming budget's based on that. We're talking about raising taxes for people. You know, that might be fine, but I'd really like us to be standing on very solid ground before that, and this just isn't making much sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petlock. So do we have any others from the public who would like to speak? I'll close the public session, and the one thing I heard was there's no way to account for time. I think that's someone mentioned that, I don't know who. I will say that I worked at Bechtel Corporation. Every time you moved, you had to write down what job you worked for. So I think that's, you know, whatever. And so, city manager or yeah.
Oh, I'd just like to hear from the consultant about the methodology of relying on self-reporting as opposed to real-time spent on projects.
Good evening. Courtney Ramos from Matrix Consulting Group. The way that cost allocation plans, user fee studies work, they're based on snapshots in time. So you have to kind of pick a period and go with that picture that you have. So for example, using budgeted expenditures or actual expenditures. Depending on the type of plan that you're putting together, the type of information that you're trying to get, you would use a different snapshot in time. When trying to get estimates of levels of effort, most cities, not just within California, but also throughout the US, actually don't do time tracking that you might see with lawyers or other types of project-based fields. That's not to say that there aren't work order systems in place that track specific projects or time such as that, but typically we don't see city clerks clocking in and out every time they're working on the agenda or answering a public records request. Same thing with the city manager or with finance. But what we do is we talk about how much time does something take. So for example, if we're talking about payroll, well, we do payroll twice a month, and it takes me a day to do payroll. So from that, we can kind of extrapolate how much time that should take. What percentage of that person's year is then spent on payroll? The same thing for looking at personnel issues, dealing with benefits and things like that, that we look at it from that perspective and try and extrapolate that way when there is not time cards that are there.
David, it'd be helpful, I think, also, Courtney, can you talk about the methodology of, again, how using, for example, number of employees, number of AP checks, the way these things were spread, because again, there is a tie to the amount of work, and there were ties to metrics that are connected to the amount of work and the amount of time that things take. And that was part of the analysis that was in the cost allocation. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So the first part of it is kind of assigning time into buckets and saying these are the kind of the major services that each department provides. And then once we have that bucket, it's figuring out how best to allocate that cost then out. And so looking within each department for the best metric that reflects that level of effort. So for example, if we're talking about payroll and looking at the number of employees and saying, should we treat every employee equally? Does it, is it fair to say that if you have more employees, I spend more time processing your payroll? In other jurisdictions, if you have police and fire, sometimes the specialty pays that go along with that might increase it. So in that kind of an instance, we might look at that metric and alter that metric or somehow weight that metric so that when we get that allocation percentage for that particular function or service, it best reflects how time is being spent on that service.
So is it task, oh, sorry, David.
I guess I do have a question. So do we have time cards for the city employees?
We have time cards, but we don't track like by project or by work item done, because again, everyone's doing a variety. If you're in street maintenance, you are supporting the entire street maintenance function. Now there are, I'm looking at our public works director. We have some technology that is, in terms of work orders, that we are going to be, some of the units are recording sometime, and we're going to be, and that's part of some of the mobile tablets. I'm looking at Colleen, and that process is going to be continuing forward. I don't know if Colleen, if you want to speak specifically to that.
Colleen Ferguson, Public Works Director, City Engineer. Before I came, the street section in Public Works was using our maintenance management system, our mobile MMS, for much of their work. And so they are continuing to do that. In the budget that's before you tonight, there's some funding coming out of the Water Master Plan to move towards that level of detail for our water system. We first have to get all the assets in the system in a point where we can pull them up and then track what we're doing based on our staff out in the field. We're at this location, turning this valve, replacing this water leak. We don't have all the assets in the system yet, and so we would invest in getting the assets in the system, and then we'll be able to track our time working on those water assets. Once that's launched, then we could look at parks.
So I think but to be clear, the way cities and particular public works departments tend to do it, it's not like a time card charging out to projects. It's based on, I go do this work order, and this work order took me 2 hours, and I'm putting that time in, so then I know, and it's tracked on this day, this was repaired, and it took 2 hours. So it's that is the technology that Colleen is referring to.
I just want to clarify. So does that mean that because some positions are given weight, that the cost allocation study sort of reflects additional employees that don't exist? It's more than the sum total of the employees shown in the budget?
That is a possibility. That was not something that we did in this plan. I was giving it as an example that it's something that you could do. So yes, in an instance like that, you could end up showing more FTE. However, it's usually documented and saying that certain types of employees have been inflated or deflated. So you should know that. But no, that was not done in this plan.
Okay, so in terms of Mr. Petlock's question, which I'm not sure I understand, but he's saying that on page 37 of our budget, it shows a certain number of FTEs, and that when you look at the cost allocation plan and put 60% in water and 40% whatever, wherever else it goes, that they do not add up to the same number. Is that true?
I could not answer that question right now.
Oh.
I could go look at the budget and look at what's in the report, but I couldn't answer that question right now.
And if it were true, it would be because it's weighted, or no? Why would that be? Or maybe you just need to.
Yeah, I don't think that, the employees and the FTE that were given to Ms. Ramos were the same FTEs we had in the 17-18 budget. Now, one thing to remember, when we are spreading costs, we're not just spreading salary and benefit time. The cost allocation spreads what are the operating costs within the budgets. So it's a full cost recovery. It's staff, for example, in finance, you've got the audit, you've got other kind of consulting pieces, or you've got other work. All of those costs are included and then spread by the methodology. So for example, Ms. Ramos takes finance and she puts it in 6 different buckets: an AP, an accounts payable bucket, a payroll bucket, a general accounting bucket, and then all the costs, the amount of time employees are spending on accounts payable goes in that bucket. And then we went through and said, all right, how many checks do we cut every year? And into each of the different receiving departments. And so based on the number of checks that are cut, those accounts payable costs got spread by that. And that's both people time and any costs that are associated with accounts payable. And that's the analysis that was done as well. So it's not just the people time.
It says here that the city of Sonoma has never had a cost allocation plan. So obviously when you're doing something new, there's some tweaking that's necessary to do. So I would imagine this takes some time while you're working the system. And could you give some examples of how that might happen? I come from this kind of a system. As I said, working for Bechtel, you know, they had jobs, and even if you did any accounting or copying or anything, it was charged to that job. And believe me, in Saudi Arabia, the construction managers would say, who's making all those copies? Honestly, they would get back to you. So I understand this very well. So my original question then.
Yeah, I think with any type of cost study like this, that it just becomes a new baseline. So if you've never done it before, then it starts as your baseline. If you're doing this 3 years after you've just done one, it becomes your new baseline. But the idea is that in between, that you're going to make improvements. It's never going to be an absolute perfect picture of what's going on. But what you're trying to do is to make it as fair and as equitable and as accurate as possible. And so sometimes, for example, we will go in and we will say, you know, it would really be helpful if you tracked this kind of a metric or this data, because it would actually be more reflective of what you're doing. And so we might not have that information when we first do something, but it is something that we can then begin tracking. And those discussions are had in meetings that we have with staff. I mean, you guys have a lot of great data that we were able to use. So that was really beneficial, but it is something where ideally you're going to continue to improve upon it. So next year or in 2 years or 3 years or whenever you do it again, ideally what would happen is you would get a little bit better. The picture would get a little clearer.
And I think one other thing just to add to what Ms. Ramos is saying, the cost allocation plan kicks out what could be charged to the different units, okay? So for example, within the water, there's the water utility, the operating, and then there's the water utility capital. The water utility capital, I want to say that number came in as the overhead charge could be about $60,000. Now, when we looked at that, we said, you know what, in those 5 years, there was one really large project and one of the biggest projects the city's done in a number of years, and that was the West Napa water main project, $2.8 million. So we pulled that number out and then ran an average, and we basically, in terms of the cost allocation plan that we've put within the water rates, we did not recommend to council to charge the full $60,000. We took 40% of that number, and that is the number that we put in. So I guess I want council and the community to know that when we did the cost allocation plan, I had no idea what these numbers were going to be. I didn't know what the original overhead was. I didn't know if it was right or wrong for water. And this was a learning lesson going through with Ms. Ramos for all of us. And we went through and tried our very best to say, okay, what's the most fair way and what seems the right thing to do as we made these decisions. And in particular, like on the one on the utility, looking at the capital projects, we basically we tempered it to be what we thought was more fair to the water utility, to the capital improvement portion. So that being said, again, it's numbers, it's a baseline. It then is kind of got to pass a smell test. And in certain places, we did some tempering that we thought was more fair. And those were what was recommended to you.
Mr. Cook?
Well, I'll go ahead and make a motion, but with a strong recommendation. I do believe that we should look at trying to get some employee tracking. I know I own a business. It takes me a long time. I use QuickBooks, but it's very simple. A lot of the bigger corporations can use self-reporting by employees, and I think that the question that Mr. Barnett brought up was a good question. It is another aspect that we can show a little bit of transparency. It sounds like Public Works is working on that. So I will be making a motion for 4.4, but I would like to see the city of Sonoma, in the future look at some time tracking by the employees.
Okay, and before we have a second, I heard there was a question, I think, and as you said, you may not be able to answer it. Page 37.
Here's where we were before, here's where we are next year, and any sort of changes between the years for the number of people working in the various jobs and departments in the city. And some of those might actually be one person that's working in a bunch of different places, or 4 people divided amongst 7 jobs. Who knows? But it's done through equivalency. So you should be able to look at a department and go, okay, there's 4 full-time people here. They all work about 2,080 hours a year. So 4 times 2,080, and then you need to divide that into the department rate, and you have your billable hourly rate fully burdened for a department.
Well, thank you. Do you understand what he's suggesting?
I do, and I do know that Matrix, we don't take the 2,080. They've already taken those hours down by assuming there's some vacation, there's some hours that's not billable. So instead of a full 2,080, I want to say it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800, 1,700. So, and that's kind of a standard practice. So in terms of the hour, that is one difference that I do know.
And I use 2,000.
Okay, usually like 40 hours a week, 2,080, that's the standard. I do know that Matrix took the hours as assuming there's vacation, assuming there's training, assuming there's some non-kind of billable work time, training time, meetings, and so they took that down to some percent.
Okay, well, I have a motion, and we can certainly make a commitment to get the answer.
Yeah, and I'm happy to have
do tonight, so.
Happy to have Mr. Pedlock have a direct conversation with Courtney or anyone on our staff. And I think to go just to one other item, I think what we haven't had is a kind of any analysis or any rationale for what our numbers have been. What we have now is a baseline. It is, I think, a point in time. And I think going forward, if we can continue to refine and get additional data and look at continuing to polish as we move forward.
Okay. Well,
Do we have a to-do list from the Courtney about what they'd like to see in data, about what specific data should be collected forward going? She said that they met with staff to talk about what they'd like to know. Do we have that list?
I would have to check with the staff that worked directly with her. So that was both Sue and so yeah, we can double check and see what that is.
Okay,
I can't tell you off the top what that was.
I'd like to see it, not at this moment, but.
Okay, thank you. So I'm still looking for a second.
I will second that.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
I'm going to vote for this. I agree with the public comment that it's lacking a lot of specific detail, and I think we should have a consideration of putting together a real plan about how we're going to start collecting that real time sooner rather than just waiting until the next study comes up. And I'm happy to agendize that later. But aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Well, and I'll repeat, this is just a baseline, so we're going to be tweaking this as we go along. I would never anticipate it's perfect, but I'm glad that you brought that up. So now it has us something to reach for, and so I'm really happy about that. And aye.
Thank you. Motion carries unanimously.
Now we're moving forward to, I'm sorry.
Moving into public hearing 5.1. This is a joint city council successor agency item. Discussion, consideration, and possible action to adopt a resolution approving the fiscal year 2018-19 City of Sonoma operating and capital improvement budget, including the establishment of the 2 new city ledger funds, waiving the annual allocation to the Public Art Fund for the fiscal year 18-19, approving fee waivers associated with the council's approved Heritage and Community Event Program, appropriating $15,000 for the annual 4th of July parade from the Community Activities Program, authorizing the city manager or her designee to execute task orders for city engineering services with GHD and approving budget adjustments for city manager's compensation and authorizing position allocations for fiscal year 18-19. And 2, adopt a resolution rescinding resolution 57-2017.
Okay, could I have clarification on this, Ms. Capriola? I think we talked about this, discussed this earlier. So, could you explain to me, this is the budget that we're going to be working on, or is this an allocation from it?
So right now we are on agenda item 5.1, which is the proposed 18-19 budget. That's correct.
Okay, so here's my concern. I don't see anything in here about reserves.
It is within the current budget. So it's in.
It hasn't been pointed out at all. It's not isolated in any way.
It is isolated. If you look in your budget on your financial summary,
right?
Sorry, on page 39 of the budget.
Right.
Okay. There is the verbiage at the very front of it is what's called general fund reserves. This is frankly a copy of your reserve policy. And then there is a pie chart that shows the current kind of signed, unassigned, and then page 42 has a breakdown of the reserve policy.
Okay. One thing I'd like to note on page 41, the emergency reserve doesn't, and maybe I'm looking wrong, doesn't agree with the number of the emergency reserve on 42.
Correct, it doesn't, because we've pulled out the 100,000.
Okay, I thought that's what
yes,
it was.
That is correct.
So somewhere in this, I think I asked to discuss the reserves that we have, and I just want to know what part of this when will we get to that?
So what is in front of you is the budget. Staff has been working to put together some revisions to the reserve policy. And as council knows, we also now have some reserve policies for the water fund that we'll be looking at. So our plan is to bring all of that back to you within the next 60 days, 90 days the outside, and look at the actual kind of drafting all that up and revising the prior resolution. Some things we've talked about doing is right now the reserve policy for your emergency reserve is based on 17% of revenues. Most agencies, it is either 15% or 17%, but it's based on expenditures. Because again, the thought is this is your emergency reserve, you have a disaster, something like we just had, and you need to be able to run your operation for a couple months on this funding. And then the other reserve is your operating reserve, and typically agencies, that is your economic uncertainty reserve. That is if you have a recession, so that you have an ability to provide some revenues and not make maybe hard, deep cuts right away, give you a little bit of a glide path and figure out what you're going to do to respond to a recession. So I think part of the analysis that I would like to do on this is that we've not been able to do so far is really go do a little bit of a history of what occurred on some of the past recessions to see how much that operating reserve should be. Should that be 1.5? Should it be 2? I don't know. Definitely think we should be looking at expenditures versus revenues. It doesn't make that much difference in terms of the number. I think you can look at whether it could be 15% or 17%. And then again, the unallocated, Sonoma has called that the special projects fund. Some of that has been assigned and some of that has been unassigned. But yeah, our plan is to bring that back and have council have a conversation. We'll also be writing up the rest of the water reserve as well.
And I think I told you I didn't agree with that today, of bringing it back. We have numbers, we've had a policy we've been living with for a long time, and I actually called Mr. Walter today about the policy because I know that in order to do some things here, I think draw out of the reserve, it's a 4/5 vote, but I actually don't think there's anything that says it has to be a 4/5 vote just to change the policy. And I have the numbers for the policy to change the policy from 17, 16, or 15. Mr. Walter, do you have an answer for me?
As you know, the council did adopt a reserve policy back in 2006. That policy was adopted pursuant to Resolution 41-2006. You're right, it calls out for a 4/5 vote of the council if it wishes to draw down the emergency reserve.
Right.
However, the council can change this policy. It can reduce the 17% to some number less than that with a simple majority of the council.
Well, I appreciate that because that seemed to be a sticking point. This is, you know, I've been talking about this for years, even before I got on this council, and I understand our city manager feels protective of these funds, but we have something that's even more important at this point is a housing trust fund, and that's why I think this is very important to actually look at these numbers. And you know, I think at 16%, it's less than the 17%, or even negotiating, I would be willing to go down to 15% of that emergency fund. So I'm just saying, this is what part of our discussion, so we can move through the other parts of this discussion, but I want to let you know I'm not interested in moving forward to reviewing, you know, another policy. This is not what I'm here for, and I've been talking about this every year I've been on this council, and I think we may need to make a commitment to a housing trust fund. Councilmember Handley actually tried to attempt to do that, and so I think it's important. I think that we need to finally do something about this, and I can only say I'm making an effort to take those funds out.
Question probably for our city attorney. So initially this was what passed by resolution, now it's a policy, so we'll have to pass another resolution setting a new policy, probably.
Yes.
Which that, I don't think we've had on our agenda yet, but do we know like a time frame as to when we'll actually specifically have reconsidering and possibly modifying the reserve policy on our agenda? Like month?
So as council knows, we've got we've got a couple of meetings. We have one meeting in July, and then we've got a couple of meetings in August. So I mean, I think we could probably bring this by the August 20th meeting at the latest. I mean, we've got drafts written, but there is some analysis, a little bit of analysis to look at. It's a pleasure of the council. I think I think it's very important to have reserves, but it's also important to not hoard reserves because those reserves are meant to invest in our community and do things. So there's a sweet spot and a balancing act to look at.
There's a difference between hoarding and being prudent. I think that this city, luckily, has been a little bit more than prudent, but I think that, you know, we've had numbers of people, and as I said, you know, an effort was made that at our last board council meeting, and I'm just very clear about this, and I don't know how we move forward. I don't want to stop this budget because I think it's important, but if there is a way by avoiding the Brown Act that we can move forward on this and possibly in a future date, but not in August, I'm sorry, I can't accept that because there's a lot that's going to be done to try to probably make this disappear, and I will not agree to that. So that's just at this point. So I don't know what the pleasure is of the council, or if the city attorney can direct us in any way.
Well, in the budget is the reserves. The problem with modifying the emergency reserve that is already been established pursuant to resolution is you would then create inconsistent actions of the council. If you were tonight to modify the emergency reserve from 17 to 16% or 15%, you are then faced with this resolution that was adopted by the council, your predecessor, that would also need to be amended. It seems to me that the proposal I'm hearing, at least from a couple of quarters, is you wouldn't touch the reserves tonight that are governed by the resolution. But there would be a strong commitment on the part of staff to bring this question of modifying the policy back to the council at the earliest possible date. We've heard that there's one meeting in July, and 2 in August and 2 in September. Mm-hmm. And there was a commitment to do this by the second meeting in August. And that may not be acceptable to the mayor, I don't know. But that was the proposal from staff in terms of addressing the reserve issue at an earliest time that was practical.
Okay, well, I just need help from the council. I don't know where, if this, are we able to discuss this for a moment? Just.
I think it's best to hear a staff report, take it to the public, and then the council is free to discuss whatever you
All right,
wish.
thank you so much. Okay, we'll go start then. Okay.
In light of kind of where we are in the hour, I am going to just briefly go through just a brief overview of the agenda of this item, sorry. So as council knows, we're here tonight to look at the operating and capital improvement budget. The operating capital improvement budget is a total of $31.6 million. General fund is about 19.4, and all other funds is about 11 million, and then the capital improvement budget is about 1.2. And so when staff put this together, part of what we did is we heard from council what you wanted to do and how you wanted to move forward. So we grouped a number of things really about protecting our community character and quality of life. So there's some additional funding in this budget for emergency planning, improvements to the plaza and depot, sidewalk and street maintenance. There's been a lot of conversation about parking in downtown, so there's funding to look at a parking strategic plan and an opportunity to lease the Casa Grande. As council knows, we've got our recreation and community service partners, so that funding exists, and also a little bit of money to help do some more focused enforcement for illegal short-term vacation rentals. But that's about really trying to protect those assets we love and the community that we love. I want to thank the Public Works Department because for the first time we really have a 5-year capital improvement budget, which will help us really look at what we need to do and try to go out and get some additional funding for some of our capital budgets. And the reality is Sonoma used with our redevelopment agency, we had about $4 million, and a large portion of that every year went to funding capital facilities and improvements. So that loss of funding is definitely left a hole and something we're going to need to work forward going forward. We've talked a lot about housing today, and again, the redevelopment agency, we had about $1.1 million when we have the redevelopment agency to invest in housing, and that money we no longer have, and nor does any city in California. But there are some pieces here. There's about $30,000 in reserves for the accessory dwelling unit. This funding, I did want to give council an update. It looks like we've got about 7 folks that have come in to use that fee waiver program or in process. So it's maybe about 15 to 20,000 so far that we're looking at being used. The budget sets aside $20,000 for housing strategy and education efforts, and then also about $20,000 to clean up our inclusionary housing ordinance after our housing impact fee is updated here as well. And then there's the one-time funding council approved for the Sonoma overnight support for homeless services for the Haven. Another item that council has talked about is really kind of improving our organizational capacity and communication and delivering of council goals. So there's some things here in terms of a webmaster to help support and really make sure we've got good public information out. There's also some funding in the city manager's office to do some training and community engagement and training for staff presentations. There's a slight increase for compensation as we look at our special events person to work with the CFAC and film permits. As we put in cost recovery for planning, there's also some funding, so we can either look at a part-time or some additional planning help to deal with the backlog we have in planning. And then there's also some funding, contract funding to assist with the city manager's office with project management and analytical support. And then there's some mobile tablets so that when our staff is out in the field, both planning and both public works and building, they're able to be efficient and not have to come back in and use some of that technology. So in addition, there's continues to be work on our financial responsibility, sustainability. So we've got the water rate study that hopefully will be concluded here over the summer. We have the cost allocation plan, which we've just spoken about, and then again, looking at a deposit-based cost recovery so that we can make sure that the general fund is not subsidizing development costs. And Ms. Ramos from Matrix will give you an update about that a little later in the agenda. We're also looking at modifying the city prosecutor, shifting some things back to the DA's office that make more sense in today's world in an administrative citation program, so we can do more direct follow-up of some municipal code violations. We're also looking at some funding to really do some analysis of pension costs and what are some ways that we can manage our pension costs, probably through some kind of a rate stabilization fund and doing some pre-funding. And then there's funding to go forward and do a study and look at our cemeteries. And that's been an object of the council for a long time. So specifically, our council goals process is not completed, but clearly council, there were a number of key initiatives where there was consensus about, and we'll talk about this a little later in the agenda as well. So looking at downtown parking, Broadway, Highway 12 streetscape and traffic realignment, the Plaza Depot Park improvements, housing, general plan, and again, the financial projects in the cemetery. So briefly about reserves. This shows that our general fund reserves, this is on the proposed budget on page 36 and 41. We currently have a little over $9 million in general fund reserves. Basically 50% of that sits in that designated emergency and operating reserve. The other is in what Sonoma has traditionally called our special projects fund. Some of that is assigned, meaning council has decided to set it aside or use it for certain things, like $500,000 is set aside for our for the general plan update. And then there's certain pieces that are unassigned. This budget takes about $730,000 from the unassigned general fund reserves and uses for capital projects, surveys, updates, and some temporary services. So this is a continued investment in our community. In terms of revenues, this shows a pie chart. This is on page 21 of the budget. And does a breakdown and clearly shows our transient occupancy tax was about 3.9. Our combined Measure U and sales tax is about 5.4 million, and our property tax about 3.9. And then our EMS revenue is another substantial revenue source that comes in fourth. Some of the other changes in this year's budget that we've talked about at the workshop is, and I mentioned a little bit previously, one, really moving to deposit-based process where our planners would track their time, and as they work on certain projects, we would have a deposit with a developer, and they would bill that developer for the time spent on those projects. And Ms. Ramos will give an update on that a little later. In addition, so there's additional revenue in this year's budget to assume that we move forward with that piece. And then we've also, some of those same, and then we're looking at updating our city fees as well. We've had a conversation with council about increasing our transient occupancy tax. This shows currently in terms of the base TOT, it does not show any of a tourism improvement district or a bid. Those rates are on top of these, what I call the base rate, but the base rate is what comes to the city. And so here you can see we're at 10%, and the majority of the rest of Sonoma and Napa County are at 12, and or Healdsburg is at 14. And there are conversations with a number of the Napa agencies that are looking at moving to 13 or 14 as well. So this is something that will be coming back on July 23rd with the draft ordinance, assuming, because there was interest at the last work session, and there was a year ago from the council to pursue this, and then we can see the July 23rd what the pleasure of the council is. So expenditures, this just shows a percent breakdown. Again, police and fire, not a surprise, is where the city spends most of its expenditures, and then public works, then followed by a breakdown of the rest of the departments. So some of the constraints and opportunities that the city faces, I do believe that we are definitely suffering for some lingering effects of losing redevelopment. This community was and we basically had over almost $5.1 million that we were able to use for in the community, and both on housing and on ways to improve both street maintenance, parks, city facilities, so historic buildings like the community center. So that's been a huge loss and a hole that we haven't filled, and we'll have to figure that out. Also, not a surprise, but with a loss of redevelopment, we are having to use general fund to backfill a lot of the capital improvement costs. and improvement programs, and that's hard to do kind of with the overall lean budget. And then we are facing, along with many, many other cities in California, an increase in our pension costs. There is quite a breakdown and discussion about pension costs within the budget. Here, I do think the city has been cautious, and yet we still face a large increase in pension costs. And we did not give some of the enhanced benefits to our miscellaneous folks. We contract out with police and fire. And I think if we hadn't done that, our pension costs would be even higher. With PERS, part of this is PERS is just not able, has not completely dug out from the loss that they had after in the recession, and they are continuing to do what they need to do, which is reduce the amount that they're assuming they're going to earn in the market. But every time they assume they're going to earn a little less, or they do earn less, that means it comes back to the employer to pick those costs up. So we are working with our employees. We have a labor management team. We'll be continuing these conversations, but this is an area that we'll be spending more time on over the next year. Opportunities we've talked about, TOT planning. Prop 68 passed in June, and that brings us an additional $200,000 a year. We don't know what we're going to get this year. Hopefully we'll find out a little bit and a little later, and then we can always do an offset where if we do get some Prop 68 money, we can potentially pull some of our general fund projects that we have, general fund money that we have in for parks projects out. And then I think, having a 4 or 5 year CIP hopefully will help us figure out which projects we want to go try to seek some regional or other grant funding on. So with that, that is a very brief overview for members of the community that were not with us when we had our study session on the budget. And staff is here happy to answer any questions of council and community.
Does the council have any questions? Oh, I'm seeing Mr. Edwards. No? David?
I have a question, but it's about the goals, but since you referenced them, it was my recollection in our goals, I'm almost certain that we talked about working to preserve the horse farm, and I didn't see that in here. And I remember Gary telling us all how to pronounce their last name, although I'm not willing to say it out loud at this moment. But I'm certain that we talked about it, and I thought we had agreement that that was one of our goals for this year, but I don't see it.
So it was not one of the key initiatives. There was definitely other projects that council talked about. You talked about water. There was some conversation about Casa Ignacio property as well. So these are what I'm calling where there was consensus of the key initiatives, the items that were kind of those big things you want to focus on for the next 2 years. Now, there are other things that council may be interested and staff may be interested in. So there's other pieces that I see as we wrap larger goals and these key initiatives go under. There's other work projects that will also be included, and we'll bring that forward. And again, if we've missed something and council says you want to pull something else up to a title of what I would call a key initiative, that's the pleasure of the council. But there definitely were other items that you had some conversation about. They just didn't all get on that final key initiative list. It doesn't mean that they're lost or won't be included on the overall 2-year plan.
Does anyone else have a question? Nope. David?
No, I was just wondering if you got your reserve answer question or your question answered.
No, I think what we said we would go through the budget, and I do have something that I'd like to say, before we vote on the budget, but thank you, and I've got it. Is there anything you'd like to? Okay. So I think at this point we're going to go out to the public. No one else has anything? We'll go out to the public.
The crowd. Larry Barnett, 637 5th Street East. I was surprised. I was pleased to see that Public Works has come up with a 5-year forecast. I am dismayed that the city itself doesn't have a 5-year forecast. Once again, I'm kind of dumbfounded. The purpose of forecasts, of course, is not to lock you into some sort of plan that you must meet. What a 5-year forecast does is based on certain kind of assumptions, gives you the opportunity to track and detect the variances to that plan. And you begin to see the kind of adjustments you need to make in your business plan, so-called, in order to make sure that you don't fritter away the money or lose it in some fashion. In the absence of that kind of financial planning, I'm going to tell you that I'm really a traditionalist when it comes to this side of things. As far as I'm concerned, while you don't really have any choice about passing a budget, I think by law you need to have a budget. I think you have to be, unfortunately at this point, despite the mayor's good intentions towards affordable housing, you are going to have to be incredibly careful. As you all know, my analysis of the city's pension problem, which went out 5 years or 6 years, showed the pension liability growing from $1.5 million or $1.8 million, whatever it is this year, to $4.5 million in 2024. That's only 6 years from now. That's not just a small problem. That's a looming, as I referred to, a time bomb. And I haven't seen any numbers come forward. In other words, I haven't seen the city's own 5-year analysis of its pension situation to rebut what it is that I was able to put together with the publicly available numbers that I had, which unfortunately may not have been the most accurate numbers one could get, but it's the best I could do. I can only work with what I have. I think that the TOT needs to be raised to 14%. To squander this opportunity and only raise it to 12% is crazy. The TOT has been 10% since I was on the city council, and I left in 2006. You really, at this point, if you want to see a difference in your budget and see that TOT increase by 40% in revenues, you've got to raise it the full 4%. That's going to bring in $1.5 million and potentially give you some of the money that you want for housing and some of the other holes that have to be filled, including the pension plan, which unfortunately you have no choice but to pre-fund. So I can leave it at that. I'll just add one last thing, if you'll permit me, Madam Mayor.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you very much. I believe that the cemetery is really not an enterprise fund. It has been subsidized by the general fund forever. The general fund has even in the past forgiven $500,000 in a loan that was made from the general fund, and that was recognized by the auditor at the time as being a fiction. I think you need to take a really hard look at the cemetery, and there were at least 2 studies done while I was on the city council about proposals of how to work with the cemetery. So there are those historical documents that I'm sure they're still in City Hall somewhere, which I think you would find valuable to read. The cemetery problem is a problem that I think is a matter of how you treat the cemetery, and really I think if you treat it as a park with some revenue stream, you're going to get out from under this fictive notion of lending money to something you'll never get back. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Chris Petlock, 426 Napa Road, Sonoma. So this is where the rubber meets the road. Nothing gets done in government that's not in the budget. I mean, we can talk all we want about we want to do this and that, but unless it's in the budget, unless you got the votes to get it done, it doesn't get done in government. So all of those things that you said you wanted to do when you campaigned, that as long as you've been up here on the dais, this is where you get it done. The rest of it is really just kind of yakking. So I encourage you to be bold. We've heard a lot of people talk about housing. We've heard a lot of people talk about a lot of things. I know that they lobby you to get it done, and unless it's done here or in some amendment later on, it's just not going to get done. So I really encourage you to be bold. Listen to your constituents. I agree. The cemetery fund, it really kind of belongs in the general fund. I think Mr. Cook pointed that out last time, that it was just kind of a bit of a sham. Just really argue for your priorities. Get those in there. I know staff put together a really nice budget that's really some of their priorities, your priorities, but it's really important that you go after what's important to you. Thank you.
Good evening, Tom Conlon, 18850 Robinson Road. I wasn't going to speak on this tonight, but I did take a gander through the budget, and listening to the conversation tonight, I want to say I am support directionally of where I hear the council going. I've heard some very good discussions tonight, and I appreciate the work that's gone into staff pulling things together for us tonight. It strikes me that we're professionalizing our budgeting process. I think it's important to set some broad allocation goals, as we appear to be doing with the allocation plan. But I like the council's follow-up to actually track where staff time is going. And I think I hear general consensus in that direction. I like the idea of raising the TOT. I agree that 12% is the lowest it should be. I'm glad to see staff seems to agree with that as well. I've heard comments much higher than that. Obviously, Healdsburg and San Francisco are already there. Those are, frankly, the communities that I think we should be benchmarking to. And obviously, we need to save for the future with our pension liability as well. So reserves and pension liabilities. Until we know what the pension liability is, it's hard to make long-term decisions about reserves. But it does sound like we'll have time to talk about that in the next session. So I look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Patricia Cullinan, you guys deserve the 4 members of the public here to hear from all of us. My comments are going to be kind of schizophrenic. I personally work on a 15-year plan to budgeting and planning for 15 years ahead. I think that for me is really effective. But I'm also here because I'm president of the Blue Wing Adobe Trust, and I wanted to stress how important the city's funding of some of the funds to purchase that property. It's a very important element in what tourists see as the city of Sonoma, that we are a rural agricultural community. So balancing everything out, think about us too, please.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak from the public? Having no one rise to the podium and come forth to the podium, I will close the public session. Are there any questions or, yeah?
So I'd like to propose some changes to this budget on 2 key fronts, and those are with regard to funding for housing and also funding for the purchase of the horse farm. In terms of housing, I support 14% TOT, putting that on the ballot and dedicating 1% in perpetuity to a housing fund unless and until redevelopment is reinstated. I am skeptical about using one-time money because I don't think that is the type of systemic approach we need to make. At this point, a 1% of the TOT will be at least $400,000 a year towards housing. I think putting that in a housing trust fund doesn't bleed our other programs. It's a new source of money, and we can, if we set the TOT at an appropriate level, we'll be able to put real funding into housing, and that in connection with the other things we're doing to create funds for housing will give us a real chance at actually having some meaningful programs. With regard to the Blue Wing Trust, I propose that we allocate $500,000 towards the purchase of that, and the way I would do that is in the capital improvement plan, I would cut the $50,000 for Depot Park, the $25,000 for neighborhood parks, and the $55,000 for recycling. That's $130,000. I think we can do those projects once we receive the money from the county under the parks bond. In addition to that, there's a net operating surplus of $100,000. I would allocate that to the Blue Wing Adobe Trust to purchasing the land. And then we've set aside $500,000 for our general plan update, but all that money won't be needed in the first year. And so I would suggest that we take $250,000 of that money and spend it for this purpose, assuming, presumptively, the TOT increase will pass. We will have a new source of money, and we will be able to put more money into the general plan update. In addition to that, we're hiring a new planning director, and I think that we should make it a requirement of their job that they actively participate in doing the general plan. They're updating it. They're not writing a novel one. And I hope that that will save us some cost. And then finally, there's a plaza tree assessment and major maintenance of $30,000. I'd like to reduce that to $20,000. And there's a downtown parking study for $40,000.
and I'd like to reduce that to $30,000. I'm not sure that the budgets here are tied to any bids. I think they're not. I think they're kind of a ballpark of what might happen, and that we can revise that ballpark down by $10,000 each. So that is those are my two proposals. There's many other important priorities, but there is only one opportunity to keep that space open, and that's going to last forever. I think it's really important, and that's my proposal.
David, do you have anything you'd like to share? No? Gary?
Well, so going back through the conversation and talking about, I'm a big fan of having reserves and having capacity to act when you need it. And when I see what's going on up in Lake County as we speak, homes being burned, buildings, businesses, etc., I think to have emergency reserves is very important. I toured today a couple of small home projects, one in the city limits and one outside the city limits, and homes that are being built for maybe couples or singles that are less than $125,000, and the encouragement for people to build those kinds of homes. We've all talked about it on this council, but nothing's really gotten done with it. My priority is you know, I love the Casa Ignacio property, and I know there's a lot of resource in this town, but for us to take our budget and throw it at that and not throw it towards housing, I have an issue with that. And I know that the property out on Arnold Drive where the horses run now, along with the cattle, that's for sale as well. And I'm not sure if the Casa Ignacio's own it, but they own the patch as well here in town. So I don't know that the horses are actually going to be there in the future. I think the property, some kind of demonstration tied in with the parks, Blue Wing, et cetera, I think would be great. But I don't know if that's going to be a reality, considering all of the other projects that are looking for money in town as well. Depot Park has just been abandoned for the last forever, pretty much. I think we have a huge resource there that we could add to. TOT, I plan on working on that committee to do it, as I did with Measure U, which, looking at the numbers, that's $2.9 million. And we made that a 5-year plan, and you know, odds are it's probably going to have to come back if we're going to go out and spend money on all of these different things. But I'm of the mind that I would rather have the money and be able to do something when we have the next emergency, when we have issues, whether it's an earthquake, another fire, maybe a flood, who knows. But I think we have a good budget here. I think we have to be conservative. We have liabilities out there. When I look at the sidewalks, I saw a guy in an electric wheelchair today nearly go over across from the Catholic Church, because we've got sidewalks that are twisting and turning, and we've got a grinding process that goes on, but we'll never catch up in my assessment. So we have a lot of infrastructure issues that we're going to be in trouble on. And you know, with the pensions, et cetera, I know it's a big number, but I think we can designate some of the dollars from the TOT that's coming up towards that issue. But I'm more of a conservative mind when it comes to spending money, and I think that you know, getting back to the Blue Wing, you know, that's an issue that everybody's got to step in for that. But you know, $7 million is a huge number, and we've got $500,000 sitting in the bank for a swimming pool that's people are trading land, and we've got $250. You know, we have to be careful about allocating those kinds of things when, you know, and I hope that gets done someday. I wish they hadn't actually taken the pool out of the high school, but maybe that's where it'll end up again. I have no idea where it is, but I just think we have to be very cautious of how we spend our money, and not, you know, and putting, you know, changing numbers just to get some kind of balance, to get some money for some other project. If it's not housing, I'm not that interested in it. So, thank you.
Let's see. A lot of my comments came at the last meeting, but this budget, I agree for the comments out there about 5-year budgets. I think we were hoping to have it this year, but are we going to have it next year? And I know for the pension numbers, I was trying to find it in here, the 5-year projection on that, because I know that we've figured those numbers out. Also, But a 5-year budget forecast, I think, is the only way that we can start getting.
Yeah, maybe just briefly to comment, if you don't mind, Councilmember Hundley. I completely agree with Mr. Barnett. Every city I've worked with, we've had a 5-year forecast. It's actually something that the assistant city manager and I have started working on after getting kind of derailed with some things this year, but without a doubt we need a 5-year forecast. I think there's a bit of good news with the pension costs, and your overall general numbers are correct. We've got $1 million increase over the next 6-7 years. However, we also have pension obligation bonds, which are about $400,000. Those will be paid off in about 3 years. So again, there's some strategy for us to think through. So it is definitely something that, again, we are in a, we're kind of taking a variety of steps forward to continue to improve the city's financial kind of status, operations, and best practices. So that'll be something this next year.
And with regard to raising the TOT, which I think we've been talking about that for a while. We had to wait until a council member was on the ballot to actually run that measure. But I have asked whether it is even legal for us to do something like variable TOT rate, where it would be higher in the summer, maybe go up to 14%, and then in the winter, when our occupancy rates are lower and we have the more conscious, cost-conscious groups that are shopping around, maybe it's some way that we can do it. But I also agree that if we're going to go out, it's been our motto to kind of lag behind the herd. So I think that considering, jumping up a little bit ahead might put us in the middle when the election's done. So that's something I certainly support. This budget I am impressed with. It doesn't have everything that I would like in it. Housing was the thing that I brought up at the last meeting, but I also recognize that I think some of the reasons things aren't in here is because they're not things that have council consensus, and it takes, it can't just be one person wanting something and it gets in here, and it takes 3 people and then them actually making it a priority to make it on the list. I think housing should be, but I think that moving forward on that, my strategy up until now was hoping that the group could somehow come to some consensus on a housing vision and what kind of housing is needed. So I think instead maybe it's just a matter of showing what is possible, a path to do it, and then figuring out how to pay for it. So that's going to be my plan in the meantime, and hopefully I can build a consensus based on that. I am prepared to pass this budget as proposed today. I would not approve the suggestions that have been suggested by our vice mayor, but I would, as a part of our direction, put some sort of clear direction that the reserve policy conversation happen, by the end of August at the latest, or something like that, or something amenable to that, so that we can get to that one sooner than later, because that one has been dragging on. And then the other piece, of course, is the cemetery, which has been creeping along for I don't know how many years, like 5 years, 15 years, I don't know. And we've heard that word a lot, and it seems like things are finally moving forward on that, and I'm really happy to see that too. And I appreciate on this staff report the things that were the sort of biggest issues of the last workshop have been covered in here, so I appreciate somebody out there listening to us.
Well, I want to start out with by thanking city staff. I think that it was a great budget. It's been a long process. I will be voting to support this. I do want to talk about a couple issues. One thing, and I liked what Vice Mayor Harrington said about some of the things that should be on the wish list, and I do believe they are. And I understand our Mayor Agramonte also. I've been on the council for 6 years. One thing a council member hears all the time is what Mr. Petlock just said. Once the budget's passed, you go to staff, they say there's no funding in the budget. Because of the Brown Act, all the council members can't get together and say, we are the ones who passed the budget. There's mid-year budgets. There's things that we can do. So sometimes that makes staff not overpowering the council, but the council not having the ability when priorities come up. Like for myself, if I said that I was for housing, people would probably say you're not, but I am. It's because when we come up here and we're trying to pass the budget and we're looking at all the issues that we have, I look at a budget as something that is transforming throughout the year. That's why we have the mid-year budget. So I would like to have an email sent by Vice Mayor Harrington to me about some of the changes, because that's something that we could look at throughout the year. And I know with the housing, I do support the TOT. I'm not sure if I support a 2% or a 3%. Always wonder why I always go in multiples, because I think that that money would be good to have in the coffers of the city of Sonoma. You know, for housing, we have our pension issue that is looming, that one of the public speakers talked about. It's really interesting. This is the year that Sonoma is going to go through a major change. I've been on the council with 9 different city council members. I think 10 count myself if I wanted to count. We've got a new city manager. We've had a new city clerk. Now we're going to have a new police chief, a new everybody's, even the public works since I've been here. The transformations have been kind of habilitating, or it's made it very hard for this council. And we do get beat up on social media a lot, because the last council I sat on, everybody said that we were a no-do council. I think we did some great things. We get beat up sometimes because it doesn't look like we're as transparent as one should be. But I think that we have a great staff. I think we have a great budget. I do want my council members to know, and my colleagues, that this is a working budget. There will be changes throughout the year. It's just not set in stone. That's why it's not in stone. It's in paper, you know, and you can take a page and you can do other things as it transforms. So with that, I would like to make a motion. Oh, okay. Then I'll hold off on my motion. But thank you, staff, for the great budget.
Okay, so I'm actually going to answer some of the things that were said. I'm glad our city manager said, you know, this pension liability, there is actually a plan. So, and you know what's so exciting? No, not exciting. Kind of interesting. We've inherited a lot of this stuff. So we're taking care of old business when you really think about it. The TOT, you know, I see it on the TID, and the hoteliers say they're going to support the 2%, but they're concerned that if we go too high, the group sales, when times are in the winter, when they have less people coming, that it's going to be an issue for them because they can't compete. And when you're talking about the cemetery, it's kind of interesting. If I was alive then, I would have sat down with General Vallejo and said, we have a gift acceptance policy, and thank you very much for this cemetery, but 50 or 60 years from now, it's going to cost us 10 times as much to bury someone. We didn't know that. And that really is the issue. There are a lot of issues. It's a real boondoggle. It's beautiful, but I think the cemetery committee, with the help of people who have run cemeteries, can actually work through this issue. And, you know, I think it's important. So there are some things that are actually being done. And, you know, it's interesting. I was chastised for not doing my business on Facebook, that I don't make comments on everything. What I do with my Facebook page is I tell people where I'm going. I've done, you know, like all of us, we do different events, we serve on different committees, and those are the things I think the public needs to know about myself and about all of us. Who cares what I think personally? That's not what my job is here. So I know that we are moving forward, and I just want to say that we can adopt the budget tonight with, as I've suggested, a provision that the EMS will be decreased if only if the just to change that policy. That's all I'm asking for. But so we are moving forward, and that's something I'm suggesting. So I think I'm just ready to move forward. So, thank you. Dear City Manager?
So at this point, there's two resolutions in front of you. One is the first resolution to pass the operating budget and capital budget with or without any changes that based on council's motion. And the other is to rescind, the second resolution is to rescind the $100,000 that we transferred out of after the fire into the fire recovery to put that back. I guess I just want to make one comment. If council wants to have a broader conversation when we bring back the reserve policy about other areas of one-time investment, you know, whether it's the Castagnaso or to review what you've set aside for planning commission, if that is you know, that we, and you want to have, obviously, I think we're on the same page that we are going to bring that back if you're not doing some other action tonight on it. But if it does come back in the next 60 days or so, we could look at agendizing it more broadly so you could have a broader conversation, not just about the policy, but about where you've reserved funds currently, if that's the prerogative of the council. So that would be helpful to know if you do want to have that conversation scheduled. If you want it to be agendized, you can have that broader conversation. We'd want to make sure we do that.
What is, Amy, you have any?
I'd like to make a motion to approve a resolution of the City of Sonoma and the successor agents of the former Sonoma Community Development Agency adopting the fiscal year 2018-19 City of Sonoma operating and capital improvement budget, including the establishment of 2 new city general ledger funds, waiving the annual allocation to the public art fund for the fiscal year 2018-19, approving heritage and community event fee waivers, and community fund programming including 4th of July, authorizing city manager or her designee to execute task orders for city engineering services with GHD Incorporated, approving budget adjustments for the city manager.
And I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Compensation and authorizing position allocations for fiscal year 2018-19.
So, and I have a question from the city attorney. How do we proceed knowing that I have a request in and Councilmember Harrington has a request in? If there is
The procedure to be followed is that once this main motion gets a second, then the two of you can make a motion to amend the main motion. And that if those motions get seconded, then you vote on the amendments first, because they may not succeed. Or if they do succeed, then they're appended to the main motion being the approval of the budget as proposed. So once this gets a second, then the mayor and the vice mayor then have the privilege of making motions to amend.
Could it be as far as if we wanted to give direction to schedule a certain meeting to discuss modifying or reviewing the reserve policy and also discuss where any surplus reserve funds could go? Could that be a separate motion, or does it have to be a part of this one?
That could be a separate motion, or you could ask the maker of this motion, you would propose a friendly amendment if you are intending to second this motion, to make the approval of the budget conditioned on a future consideration of the reserve policy and the other items just mentioned.
Yeah, I guess. I don't really read Robertson's rules of orders to say that.
So
but.
You are the person that made the motion.
Well, I would amend Councilmember Hunley's request to add that to the
and that
motion.
would include what?
So it wouldn't have any changes today, but it'd be setting a date to review the reserve policy and have the capacity to discuss where surplus funds could go. And I will second that motion.
Correct. So the motion right now would be to approve the budget as was submitted by staff, with the reserve policy coming back. And when the reserve policy comes back for consideration, would also then bring back, it would be agendized broad enough so you could look at where you have assigned money to other things, whether it's $500,000 for the general plan, as Vice Mayor Harrington said, wanting to review that and potentially look at a resourcing of that funds. You know, you've also got, there's a few, you've got most of your general fund is within your general fund reserves. You do have the 250,000 for the splash is in a separate fund. I think we would take a look and make sure that there's.
The end date on that is 2021, and it's not for capital, it's for swimming lessons.
Correct. So there are a few other, but that's like that's really kind of a designated general fund that's in a separate fund. But most of your assigned is listed in the budget currently, but again, we could agendize it broadly so you could be looking at not only the policy, but you could review the overall use of general fund reserve.
Was that the intent of your recommendation, Councilmember Hundley?
Could you summarize that again? I can tell you what I was saying.
Oh, yes, what were you saying?
We would have a meeting. It sounded like August 20th was the likely date, but on or before August 20th, that we will have a meeting where we review the reserve policy, but agendize it broad enough so that we could also talk about where we could spend surplus funds that no longer have to be in the reserves under a modified policy.
Yes, and when
so I don't think, Kathy, that what you said is what she was saying. I think she was saying that if in fact the reserves, for example, go from 17 to 15, that means there's going to be some money freed up, and there'd be a discussion where that money might be spent.
Yes, and I will.
That's what I thought you were saying. I'm not sure Kathy was saying that.
No, I did. I was fine with it. I was meaning to say that. It's not only looking at one, if the reserve policies, if you make a change in a reserve policy and it's lowered, and you then have excess general fund reserves that could be programmed, and or looking at where you've programmed currently excess general fund reserves, and do you want to retain that programming or do you want to reassign it? So I think we would want to agendize it broad enough that it's not just talking about the policy, that you can actually talk about the money once you make a decision about the policy.
And I'd be happy to add that to the original resolution.
All the way. Oh, okay, you're back. Yes.
Roll call, please.
Well, let me.
Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
I'm not going to support this, and I just want to say that a lot of complaining happens about our inability to do anything, and the way you do stuff in government is by looking at what the proposed stuff is, and if you don't think it's a priority, cutting it and doing something else. So this budget represents the majority of this council. This is what you want to do. You don't want to spend any money, extra money on housing, and you don't want to support the horse farm. And I think that's incredibly disappointing and not what the people of the town want. So I'm not going to support it.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Well, I'm yes on this, but I'm such a hopeful person that I think there is going to be something. And that's just the way I live. Back to the homeless issue, I don't want to talk about it, but
Thank you. Motion carries 4-1.
I will make a shorter motion this time. I make a motion to approve resolution of the City Council of the City of Sonoma rescinding resolution number 57-2017.
Second.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries unanimously.
Mayor Agramonte, could we take a 5-minute break, stretch break, before we move to the next item? We can get situated. Thank you.
committee chair that was doing this. Honest to God, I love to whack it. First of all, I'd like to announce that this is Mr. Edwards' anniversary this evening. How many years?
13.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's amazing. And your wife's name is Rose?
It's Ruth.
Ruth.
And my kids' names are Madeline and Sullivan.
And Sullivan. Well, boy, I'm old. I can't help you. I have a bad memory. I was ready to say Ruth. God, I must have Tourette's.
Sure.
Yeah, or something. Yeah, I'll leave you.
You say that again and turn it
I'll tee you up.
Do we have do you have it loaded or do you need me to put it?
We are moving on to 6.1. I'm sorry.
Discussion, direction, and possible action on the proposed water rates and initiation of the Preposition 218 public notice for the 2018 water rate study.
Great. Good evening, Mayor Agramonte and council members. So, as council's well aware, this has been about a year process to update our water rate study, and I'm pleased to be here tonight. With us is Sally Van Eden, who is with Raf Tellis, and you have seen her a couple times present, at least 3, if not 4. And then also Michael Colantino, who is our special counsel, assisting us with this process. So the plan for tonight is to give you a brief overview, and then we'll be looking for some direction on the rates and then our next steps. So with that, I'll turn it to Sally to provide an overview.
Let me provide one comment before Sally starts, just to give you a sense of what you're asked to do tonight and what you're not asked to do tonight. Legally, you're not doing anything tonight. You're allowing staff to issue a notice of a hearing. That notice will go out, there will be a hearing, and at that hearing, we will tally protests, and then you will be authorized, in the absence of majority protests, to adopt rates. You will be expected to adopt rates for the next year. Conceivably, you could adopt rates for 5 years, but you don't have to. Once you've accomplished Prop 218 compliance, which is a notice which staff could send out, a hearing which you will conduct, and the tallying of protests, you've complied with 218 and don't have to do it again for 5 years, provided that you don't impose rates that are higher than those covered by the cost of service analysis. So this feels like this big moment when you're about to set water rates for 5 years and commit yourself to this plan, and it's not. It is an opportunity for staff to check in with you before they issue a notice to the whole community about a proposal that we shouldn't have out there unless you're comfortable with it being out there. But even with it being out there, you're not asked to commit to it tonight. And in fact, you won't even be asked to commit to all of it when you set rates for the next year. So it's an elephant, but we are going to eat it a slice at a time. And all we're doing tonight is describing the menu.
What does tally protest mean?
Under Prop 218, anybody who is a customer of record or the owner of a property that we serve is authorized to protest in writing, objecting to the rates that have been proposed. If those written objections are received by the clerk before the close of the public hearing that we're suggesting you allow us to notice for August 20th, if those add up to 50% plus 1 of all of the accounts of your utility, you will be prohibited from imposing the rates that are proposed. Such a protest is, shall we say, uncommon. It occurs in very small districts with very large increases. Like there's a sewer district in Nevada County with 84 people that were asked to pay $4,000 a year for sewer service. They got their act together and did a protest. But in a system any larger and a rate any smaller, you're not likely to see a majority protest. But the majority protest process still allows a useful dialogue between the community and the council about what you're doing. Your rules, which look suspiciously like rules that I've written in other communities, say that if the number of protests received by the clerk is manifestly fewer than a majority, you can just deem them all valid without actually investing the resources to tally them and say, we got X protests, we'll treat them all as good, and it's not a majority.
Okay, with that, good evening, and thank you to your very hardworking staff. We have been moving along as quickly as possible. to complete the draft study and to get us to the point that we are at. So tonight, I'm also striving to make a shorter presentation every time I come up here. So we're going to talk about where we are in the process, which is quite near to the end. We're going to look at the proposed financial plan once again, and we're going to look at proposed rates. We've taken into account everything that was discussed as much as we could at the last workshop, at direction of staff and their compilation of the thoughts about the responses. And we have gone ahead and we are at June 25th on the big arrow there, the report and the rate decision. And as Mr. Colantano was just describing, the Prop 218 notice would follow. Again, just kind of an overview. This is a slide that you have seen before, sort of in kind of simplified terms describing, what are we doing and why. We were looking at some updates that were promoted by some legal changes, precisely the reconsideration of conservation tiers, the underlying concept being that tiers must be associated with actual costs, can't be an incentive. We also talked at length, especially in the second presentation, about funding capital investments. So we also spoke about that again on the third presentation. And this incorporated information from the Water Master Plan. We also spoke about building reserve balances within the water division, separate from the rest of the city, looking at an optimal reserve level, building that up to about 3.3. And then we talked about affordability. We talked about infrastructure investment. We talked about financial stability as some of the key policy objectives. And we are looking at setting rates for the next 5 years. So what has happened since the June 4th workshop? We did prepare the draft water rate study. It's if you read through it, it's not the most exciting reading. It's very thorough. It gets very much into the nitty-gritty of each and every equation that's included in the analysis. But it is all there for a purpose, and it is for to provide as excellent documentation of how the rates were actually built as possible, and all the assumptions, underlying assumptions, and basically all the math. Now, we did, at staff's direction, go back and make a few changes in the potential calculations. And one of them was proposing to remove expenditure of about $40,000 in supplies and conservation in funding in the water operating costs. This was the goal of this was to bring these rates down as much as we could while still achieving some of these other goals. I also want to highlight the Rate Stabilization Reserve Fund. It starts at 10%, and we're moving to 15% in this particular rate cycle. The goal would be to get that Rate Stabilization Fund up to about 20%, but that may have to wait until the next rate cycle in order to keep rates as a reasonable level as we could. Again, just to highlight of the reserves, what is the Rate Stabilization Reserve Fund? And that the goal of that reserve fund is to have some funding available in case there is an unforeseen situation. It's not a full-on drought rate, but that would be a potential use if you had a reduction in anticipated revenue due to a drought, for example. Before moving on to a drought rate schedule, one could use some of those funds, those reserve funds, to help bridge the gap. We've also shifted the timing, and this was a change that was somewhat unforeseen, but it seemed like a very good idea once we thought about it some more and at the direction of staff. Originally, we had planned to implement this, or to suggest this be implemented the January 1st date. And there was a desire to go ahead and get a first small increment of rate increase in place. That helps get some additional funding in to meet the goals and objectives. And it also nicely aligns then going forward with the July 1st implementation date, which would align with your fiscal year. So then you would have the process of looking at budget ahead, looking at actual revenues that were received from your water rates, being able to make any adjustments if necessary, downward adjustments at that point. Why I say that is you cannot increase rates without going out to a Prop 218. But should you have a situation where for whatever reason you have additional funding or more funding than expected, or got a grant or got some other additional type of funding, it is at your prerogative to not go with the full rate increase. And I'd like to just check in with Michael. I don't see any jumping up and down there, so I think that's fairly accurate. But okay, great. And then we also rethought the elevation charge. Looking and making sure with a map and looking to make sure that we are really dealing with elevation and the costs associated with getting water pumped up to elevation for that elevation charge. So again, back to the recommendations and the reserves. We're looking at 2 months of operating and maintenance budget. Maybe a little low. A goal would be to increase that a bit, but a good starting place. Capital reserve is an average of 1 year of the CIP spending based on the next 5 years of projected CIP. Just a footnote, we did not include debt-funded, projected debt-funded items in that calculation. And then the rate stabilization reserve fund that I just mentioned, 10% of commodity revenue, but increasing to 15% by fiscal year 2023, 1% at a time. The capital projects in this proposed rate structure and schedule, it does retain the AMI, the Advanced Metering Infrastructure. It does include upsizing of pipes for fire flow, and it does include the renewal and replacement of existing pipelines beginning in fiscal year 2022. And again, key factors affecting the financial plan, why bother to go ahead and do another study other than it's good practice, is to shift away from the conservation tiers due to some changes in the law. That does unfortunately increase some costs to lower water users. The 6% annual water purchase cost increase, you may recall Ms. Roselli from SCWA came and presented in front of this body and mentioned the 6% increase for this fiscal year, and staff anticipates that will be a likely amount going forward. The average of almost $1.5 million in annual capital improvement, investing in your infrastructure through fiscal year 2023. That does not include all of the master plan list. There are some that are held for the next cycle. Creating reserves per the policy objectives, and overall, there's a few other benefits are a little higher than a 3%, but basically also accounts for a 3% annual inflation cost of living on many of the costs included in the financial plan. So the proposed revenue adjustment, the amount of overall revenue increase in order to achieve these goals suggested for this fiscal year 2019 is 3.5% with an implementation date of September 1, 2018. So that would be sort of the catch-up amount. And then going forward, fiscal year 2020 through 2023 would be a 7.5 increase starting each July 1st, beginning of each fiscal year. Staff strove to get that amount below 8% and still achieve the goals that we felt were reflected back.
Can I ask a question? Is the extra 4 months of 3.5%, does that make it equivalent to being 7.5% in the following year? What's the total? Like if it was condensed to 12 months, how much would it be?
I think it's a little more because you already did approximately a 5% increase that took place.
I mean for 2019, we're showing that it's 3.5%, but since it's actually starting in 2018, there's an additional 4 months of 3.5%.
So is that how many months?
Again, I am going to go back to the amount that was implemented already starting if I don't understand the question.
are you trying to make it appear that the actual increase for 2019 is smaller by adding on 4 months of that increase? So it's actually 16 months. If you needed the same amount of money in a 12-month period, what would the percentage be? If I want to make it look like I'm charging you less, I will charge you a smaller number for a longer period of time. Right? So this is an extra 4 months of 3.5%.
But it's not a one-time increase in the rates. So you've got a current rate, it goes up 3.5 at this point, and then it goes up at this point. So at a certain level, there isn't a way to combine a fixed fee spread over a limited period. It's an ongoing charge. You're going to spread it for whatever period it's spread.
Well, why doesn't it just start in 2019?
I think the thought was to warm up the bathtub slowly and to get more funding into the system because we need it.
Yeah, originally I think this, Raftellus always assumed that, again, we were moving forward to do this because we were also, remember, our revenues weren't coming in and we had lost some revenues. So typically clients who do this want to put it in right away. And so their assumption, their model had been we would be starting, as soon as we can get it approved, September. Staff's assumption had been kind of the January, because that's when kind of we do it annually. And we looked at every month we don't do it was like a $30,000 loss of revenue. And so then we thought, all right, well, it makes more sense to try to operationalize this with our budget as well. Because the other thing that happens with our staff is these water rates are being changed. We put them out typically for the January. We're putting the notice out in November. We're getting all kinds of questions December. It's the same time the same person is doing all the business license. So all the business license, those annual renewals, and all of that comes at the same time. And frankly, it's too much. So there was a variety of reasons for budgeting, for operation, that we said, well, what if we start it now, and then it lets us align our operation and align the fiscal year. That's kind of what our thought process was.
It's a hint. Yeah.
So maybe the real question is, what is the total, if this passes, what is the total rate for this year?
Fiscal year 2018. And then again, Kathy, from the other rate increase that occurred on February 2nd was approximately 5%, correct?
Maybe we can take the question. Sue can maybe run a little numbers, and let's come back to that answer, because I don't want to give you an incorrect answer in the moment. So let's proceed, and we'll come back.
Excuse me for not tracking with you, completely correctly. But yes, the total for fiscal year 2018 will be a little more than 8%. This will be a prorated amount because of that amount that was already implemented.
Right, yeah. I was saying it's not just the two numbers added together because it's only for 4 months.
Right, it's a little prorated, exactly.
That's correct. And then the January billing actually didn't start until February 1 instead of January 1, so there was a little
there was more adjustment made, yeah.
Just another comment, another thing we talked about at the staff level as we went through all this was, there was the rate increase in February, and then this one proposed for September, but it's not for 1 year, it's for 1.5 years.
Okay, to move on? Okay. This is the proposed financial plan with the lovely colors showing the stacked bars, your O&M expenses in orange, water supply costs cleverly in blue, your debt service amounts, because we are suggesting a debt service of about $3.6 million to pay for the AMI, and I believe it's the fire line. Is it a fire line? Yeah, it's been a long day. Sorry. and the point of this is to show that with these increases throughout the projected 5-year fiscal year, you do achieve your all of your goals. Your red line there is what your projected revenues would be if the current rates remained unchanged. And the blue line indicates the revenues at the proposed rates under the proposed financial plan. This is a similar bar chart, and the point of this is to show if you are achieving your reserve policy rates Those are the ones we described. You'll see, well, why are some of those blue bars up higher? There are some, as we call, PAYGO, capital improvements, which will bring down those balances. But again, the goal at 2023 is to have collected enough money for all your needs, including those reserve fund needs, at the slightly decreased amounts. Wanted to look a bit more in a chart form at the current structure versus the proposed structure. The current structure had 4 tiers. That last tier was sort of a conservation incentive tier for your very high-end users in terms of the amount of water. Your tier widths, as we call them, were 6,000 gallons per tier. So 0 to 6 was your tier 1, 6 to 12,000 gallons, tier 2, and 12 to 18 in your tier 3, and then that tier 4 was everything above 18,000 gallons per month. The proposed structure is a lot lower in terms of smaller tiers. So your proposed structure in tier 1, that's your kind of average use by your lower users, your lowest users. It's the most affordable. Your well water is your cheaper water source. So 100% of your well water is allocated to that tier 1. And then the remainder is backfilled by the more expensive SCWA water. 2 to 7 gallons, a 5 kgal tier width. And we chose that because by looking at your account usage data and doing analysis, identified that 7,000 gallons is the average single-family residential use for your customers. And then anything above the 7,000 gallons per month was all use above your average users. And so we used that information from our account analysis to help kind of structure the tiers. Again, with an eye towards trying to keep things as affordable as possible for your users who are using the least amount of water on a monthly basis. These are the proposed fixed charges. Your current fixed charges are on the left, and then your fixed charges for 2019, 2020 through 2023 on the right. There is about a $2 increase per year. Don't want to forget to bring your attention to some of these documents, and I will so at the end, but they do pertain to a correction that we needed to make in the draft report pertaining to the current fixed charges. Excuse me, not the fixed charges, the current volumetric charges. You'll see there. These are, again, demonstrate the current tiers and tier rates compared to what we are proposing for the next 5 years. I am zipping through this, so if anyone has any more questions, please. This is the proposed fire line charges. That's separate for dedicated fire lines. And you'll note and may or may not recall from our discussion in the last workshop, we used a very different methodology than the prior report had done. And so that's not an error. That goes down to from almost $7 per kgal to 60 cents for the 2-inch meters. That is part of our account-based analysis. We had a significant difference in our methodology from the prior report. And we are also proposing the elevation zone. This is a map, and I hope you can see from the audience, it's not terribly good. You guys, did you get a handout? Okay. Took a reanalysis and looked at this and wanted to identify the users that were truly in a higher elevation zone, because the point of this was to capture additional costs to get basically water up the hill. And those costs are not insignificant for Zone 2.
So this represents a judgment that it makes sense to have a rate structure that does not distinguish among all of your valley customers, even though they have slightly different arrays of infrastructure that supports them, but that the elevation is meaningfully different, and therefore you choose. And you don't there's no right answer here, there's no wrong answer, but that's a distinction you choose to make, and it has a basis based in pumping charges to achieve elevation, and we've isolated the folks who have that characteristic.
And going back, since we were isolating folks, we did want to provide a map. So there's also one in the draft report. That'll be replaced with this one. It's more of an explanation of following up on what Michael just said. He sort of explained my chart for me. Thank you. And here is something that people are always very interested in, because it's a chart that shows the kitchen table discussion what's going to happen to your total monthly bill at different usage levels. And so you will see that until you get into the approximately 20,000 gallons per month or greater, that there are not decreases, there are increases along the way. And mostly after that 20,000, it's because the elimination of that conservation tier 4.
And the loss of this element of the conservation tendency of your prices is a legal consequence of a particular decision, which is the law today and may not always be the law. And when we get more clarification from higher courts, we may be able to return to a stronger price signal to conserve.
And it's really a shame because, you know, overall, I think we're trying to conserve, but to use more than possibly a person should, if they can afford it, it doesn't matter, but it hurts all of us.
And the irony here is that this ballot measure has a fairly libertarian perspective, that government should not impose more than it needs to. But the consequence is that if we can't use price signals to achieve necessary conservation, we're going to use command and control instead. And that is hardly the outcome our libertarian framers would have had in mind.
Yeah, as I said, it's a shame.
Be careful what you ask for, you may get it.
And then one last chart, and I would like to thank Mr. Petlock and identify that we made an error in the slide that we showed on June 4th for the Valley of the Moon. We accidentally, they have a bi-monthly bill, and we forgot to cut the what we call the monthly charge in half. So I apologize to Mr. Petlock. Thank you for pointing it out and also following up with an email, very helpful. And so this reflects the appropriate level. Ms. Capriola also mentioned that City of Hillsburg is often a comparison point and that we had not included that the last time, so we did add that. And we did go back and recheck if anyone else had posted any of their newer rates among those who are Petaluma, North Marin, and are the 2018, but they do not have any increase posted for fiscal year 2019 yet.
And this shows what we often see, that the lowest rates are the oldest rates, and that your neighbors will catch up with you eventually when they start to account for their costs. Everybody's still recovering from the drought.
So the actions tonight, actually at this point I would like to pause and just point out some departures from the draft report that you got in your package. We did find an error in the current rates column, accidentally pulled the wrong rate amounts. So those items are in the tracking mode, and those have been corrected. They were not incorrect in the model. They were just incorrect in the table. So that pertains to the first page and the middle page. And then our attorneys, your attorneys, not our attorneys, had a few changes. I'm going to start with the very last page and mention that Michael's office asked for a revenue proof. The point of the revenue proof is to show that you are, with the proposed rates, you will achieve collection of the 3.5%, at least the 3.5% of the revenue requirement increase. This is for the first year. There would be a complementary table for each and every year. You'll note that there's a slight difference between the cost of service total and the total. That's less than 1% within those two last columns, which is due to rounding. The important piece is that if you looked at table 25 and looked at the beginning balance on that top of that table, the total compared to that is your 1.035%. So you got a longer explanation of that appendix because we accidentally put the wrong number in at the end. So that there's the correction there. And also, Mr. Colantano had some very specific experience and input to the description of the fire line costs and fire in general.
Although the cost of service analysis is quite detailed, it's still the summary of a whole lot of work that takes the form of a bunch of interlocking spreadsheets that nobody but an accountant would really want to spend much time with. And so there's a lot of work that's implicit, and it's fine for it to be implicit until you have a trial court screw something up, and then you end up in the Court of Appeal having an argument about the law. And since I'm in the Court of Appeal in Los Angeles at the moment on the question of what fire flow is, I thought it would be helpful to you to define your terms out where people can see them. When people hear the word fire flow, they want to think the cost of putting fire hydrants in the street and the cost of the very small amount of water that actually goes through fire hydrants in a year. That's not what fire flow is. Fire flow is that characteristic of your water utility which is capable of supplying water in the volumes and at the pressure necessary to fight fires. That drives your supply, your storage, your transmission, your distribution. It's marbled through the utility. It's a fundamental design characteristic of a utility. It's an important part of your costs, and it's legally mandated. And so all we're doing here is putting a particular definition of terms out where people can see it so that I don't have to explain this to a judge another time.
So does this depend upon the size of the width of the pipe?
Yep.
Okay.
How big the pipe is and how much water there is behind it.
Okay, thank you. And with that, realizing that this is a challenging, was a good conversation on June 4th, but there is challenge because there's pros and cons. Trying to, again, to balance some of the direction that staff felt they heard from City Council, keeping in mind desire for certain pieces of infrastructure, desire for other infrastructure projects that unfortunately could not be accomplished during this particular rate cycle without increasing rates even further. Making that adjustment to the fiscal year, and that is with the prorated amount slightly more than the 7.5% going forward. It's not insignificant changes, but it will allow the city to fund the revenue requirements associated with the additional reserves, with capital improvement projects that are included, and with the increases in anticipated water costs from SCWA, and also just with sort of the general inflation. So looking tonight for direction whether or not to go forward with these proposed water rates, and then there would be direction to initiate the Prop 218 public notice process and to schedule a public hearing for that process.
So, sorry.
Sorry, before we go to council questions, I did want to go back to Vice Mayor Harrington's question, as I understood it. So as we understood, what you were saying is February 1, the rates went up 5% is what they went up. And then based on this proposal, September 1, they would go up an additional 3.5. So what is that overall increment over the 12 months? So what that basically means, the effective rate increase for someone it'd be 8.63% for the, for someone who started in February gets a 3.5. Now again, they're not going to get another rate increase then until the July of 2019. So there's a gap where that carries longer. I think that answers your question. Thank you.
Are there any questions from the council? Comments?
I have a question. I was informed that it's a fairly typical practice for councils to set rates every year and not 5 years in a row. Is that true?
We have had clients who do it either way. There's a lot of argument for the longer budget cycle and thinking ahead. I heard some of that earlier this evening. So there's good prudence in just doing a budget. My experience is that more often cities and districts go with the 5-year.
And what I would tell you is you don't want to do the cost of service analysis any more frequently than every 5 years because it's painful and expensive, and you just don't gain that much for the brain damage. So the real choice is, if you're going to do a 5-year cost of service analysis, which is advisable, are you going to commit to all 5 years of those rates up front and put the system on autopilot, or are you going to want to check in with a hearing periodically to take political responsibility for the rates, to give the community a chance to weigh in and to make sure you need it? The upside of that is that continuing community dialogue. The downside is you may be tempted to stray from the path of the fiscal needs of the utility. And that's the balance you get to strike.
Good evening again, Council. So I'm going to start by arguing very strongly, based on our earlier discussions from the cost allocation study, that you just adopt 1 year, take some time, look at how that cost allocation study really pans out. Are these the true and real costs for the utility? I strongly recommend that. Back to the earlier comment on the libertarian point of view, for this kind of thing. I mean, these were constitutional amendments passed by voters. You know, if you were on the higher end of that, or you were in a city where, you know, taxes, you were paying for, you know, all kinds of crazy things in some of these cities, including, you know, outrageous salaries for some of the councilmen. I'm sure they would disagree with that. You know, this is public money. So anyway, start with that. So majority of protest, that came up earlier. You know, this is a big move. It could rally a lot of people, but really it only takes one motivated ratepayer to kind of send all this stuff into a tizzy. It only takes one person to challenge something like this. You know, so I would be very cautious, especially considering the questions related to the underlying cost analysis. Until you're really solid that these are the true and real costs of this utility. Not only is there Prop 218, but there's also Prop 26 that governs all of this, and that is, you know, am I paying for the service that I'm getting? That's very important in all of this. So just thinking about the tiers real quickly, and I'm sure all this is fine, but it doesn't hurt to ask. You know, if Tier 1 is well water, and it's 100% well water, based on the water study that was done earlier, the wells don't produce enough water to satisfy all the demand in Tier 1 at 2,000 gallons a month. So that means Tier 1 is a blended rate. Assume something like that. No, that's just, I have it in my mind. It's easy enough. So then that means Tier 2 is all SQA, Sonoma County Water Agency water. So then what is really the justification for Tier 3? Are those peaking charges, you know, so how do you get from, you know, whatever that Tier 2 rate is up to the Tier 3 rate, and do you feel really solid about that? It's not Tier 1, well, maybe the low tier amount in Tier 1 people will complain about, but if people get caught in Tier 3 and feel like they're being gouged, that will be a problem. And that's all I really have. Thank you.
Chair Petlock.
Hi again, Tom Conlon. So I took a look at the single-family residential sample rate slide, number 17, and if I've done my math correctly, I try to turn these numbers into percentage increases, because the numbers we were talking about earlier, 3.5% and 8 point something, if you do the 16-month analysis, aren't really what's reflected at the kitchen table. So it's these numbers, I understand, on that single family table that are the ones people are going to experience. And I calculated 2,000 gallons, you're going to see an 11.88% increase. That's just $3.40 over $28.62. The next tier, 23% increase. The next tier, 20%, 7.4%. And then at the two highest tiers, 20,000 and 30,000, you're going to see a decrease. And compared to other cities I've seen go through this, I think that's probably pretty good. Unfortunately, that's how drastic the situation we're in right now is. You guys probably know far better than I how this benchmarks to other communities. But I do think it's important that we sell this as well as we can to the ratepayers. So, you know, make sure you get in front of it and disclose these percentage numbers and do some explanation that you really have no choice but to do it this way by law until it can change in the future. And then to Chris's point about one person can throw a big monkey wrench into this, that's true. So just be conscious of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conlon. I'm sorry, do we have any other comments from the public? If not, I think you want to.
Yeah, I want to get a few comments back. I'm going to work in reverse order, if you don't mind, just because of the slides. So looking at the kitchen table discussion, as 2 reminders, it's an overall 3.5% increase for this first chunk, and then 7.5 later going forward in the overall revenue requirements. It does not, as I forget your Tom mentioned, it does not unfortunately evenly get applied to each group. And if you looked at all the other sample customer base comparisons that could be done, there would be different amounts as well. And recall that as an unfortunate result of the abolition of the conservation-based rate due to the San Juan Capistrano decision, at least currently, unfortunately, the costs that you were previously recovering through that Tier 4 does get filtered back onto everyone else. There was also, as I recall, a slight increase in the meter charge to volumetric ratio, again, done for financial stability, so good reasons for doing it, but there is an unfortunate reality that the lower tiers do get more of a hit, if you will, as although we strove to reduce that impact as much as possible. The 2-gallon, this very small tier width, was identified as a way to try to give folks in that lowest water use category the benefit of most of the well water. The well water, and I feel like our graphic must not have been very good here. It's not 100% well water in that tier. It's that 100% of the cheapest water is applied in that tier. So it is a blended rate, as Mr. Petlock correctly identified. The second tier was based purely on average single-family residential use, and then the peaking factors are included in the third tier, as I recall in our analysis.
So I think what you're sharing is not only it's a shame that we can't reach our conservation goals, and the second shame is that people who are at the lower end use less water are going to be charged more because of people who use.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we did work, the rate structure is both a science and an art, and we did work to try to minimize that effect as much as possible by using the very small tier width in Tier 1 and allocating all of the cheapest water into that tier. So that was very purposeful.
Right. Then I see that, and it's a shame, but for the lawsuit that we are here today to do this.
Mr. Petlock, did I
That's not
forget
just
any
us.
of your comments?
It's all the cities or just.
Okay, I hit it all. Okay. Yeah. And the water master plan does include a pretty significant increase from 147 kgal per year to 248, and we did include that in the analysis and assume that that is happening, and that allowed the blended rate to be as low as it is.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, and where are we going now? Do you have questions?
It's time for questions or council discussion.
And again, the recommended action is simply to authorize staff to issue the notice for the hearing on these proposals.
Right. I think, what is it here? Direct staff to complete the Proposition 218 public hearing 45-day notice and tentatively set a date of August 20th for the public hearing, assuming all timeline requirements can be met. That's what we're striving for. Thanks. Yes.
Well, I will be supporting this today, supporting putting out the notice, and there were times when it didn't seem like that we would arrive at this point in our water rate journey, but we're here, and I just wanted to say thank you to staff for somewhat scrambling because we weren't exactly planning on doing this when we did it, but we did, and here we are. And the people, the help that we've had, thank you for making everything very understandable and talking about something that's very complex. I feel like I've learned a lot more about how all this works. And even though we never want to see our water rates increase, I do think that it is essential that we, one, improve our reserve situation, you know, having just gone through a disaster and thankfully not being in a position where we need it. It made me realize even more that we need to be better prepared for that. And also, moving forward, there were a lot of things that we would love to have on our project list. Personally, recycled water that I really hope to see on there one day. But I realize that it's a balance here, and by putting everything on the list, it would just be completely unaffordable, and people would, you know, probably show up with pitchforks. So I think this is a really nice balance of being able to do things like work on, you know, replacing all of our old pipes in the cities over the next 50 years and a lot of the other things that are going to make us a lot safer. So I think it's a great balance. I know that it's really challenging. And I'm also glad that there was a way to, because a lot of us were concerned about the smallest water users and for people who are on fixed incomes and what this would do to them, knowing that we couldn't, you know, as in the past, sort of use different tiers to balance each other out. I'm glad that we figured out a way to at least, you know, credit our most affordable water to them. So thank you all very much.
So I'm going to be supporting as well, and I'm looking forward to my advanced metering opportunity so I can save a little money on my home property. But on my commercial property, I think that my tenants use nothing, and I still pay that fee, and that's okay because it's something that, you know, I have to do. But I'm going to be supporting as well, and I think we have a lot of infrastructure, not only on top of the ground but under the ground we have to take care of. And my years here in Sonoma, I've seen a lot of streets torn up. I've seen water leaks. I've seen main breaks and all sorts of things, and I'd like to pay for it now rather than pay for it later.
David?
I'll be supporting, and thanks for the good work.
I support sending out the notice, and if people think that, I think the rate increase is still fairly high for poor people. I'm concerned about that, but you know, people have to take it upon themselves to get active in their government, and they're going to receive the notice, and if it's too high and it's a serious problem, then they need to come down here and tell us. So they have a remedy, and I support that, but I am concerned about the poorest people where even small increases in costs really affect them.
Thank you. So do you hear, Kathy, that we're directing you to, do we need a motion for this?
Yes, it'd be good to have a motion if you're in agreement to.
Yes. And a second? Did I?
Oh, I'll do more clearly. This one has a short title to it. I would like to make a motion to direct staff to complete the Proposition 218 public hearing 45-day notice and tentatively set a date of August 20th for the public hearing, assuming all timeline and requirements can be met.
I'll second that.
May I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Hunley?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously.
On to 6.2.
Yes, thank you, Council. Thank you, consultants. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're moving to 6.2, hear an update regarding proposed changes in planning fees with a shift to deposit-based cost recovery and appoint an ad hoc city council subcommittee to review fees.
So council, just wait a minute. We've got a different PowerPoint to get up for you. So while we get it up, I'd like to introduce Courtney Ramos with Matrix Consulting. So as council knows, we did the cost allocation plan, and then as part of the RFP of selecting a consultant, we also, that was the phase 1, and we asked the phase 2 was to do a complete review of our fees. And in looking at all of our fees, our planning fees are the fees that are the most under in terms of our collection. And so in light of the amount of development projects and things that are going on, I asked Matrix Consulting to pull that out and do that and look at those now. And so Ms. Ramos will give you an overview of kind of the planning piece. I'm not looking for any direction from council tonight. Our plan is to come back to you on July 23rd with some recommendations, assuming that you are comfortable with this general approach. I would like to ask for 2 council members to work on an ad hoc with us during the first couple weeks of July, where we can meet with Ms. Ramos and review not only the deposit-based fees that she'll outline, but also the flat fees, to see what the comfort level is as we look at bringing those fees back to on the July 23rd, because we will need to do a noticed hearing 10 days before. So there's probably looking for someone, 2 council members to work with us for a couple hours the week of the 8th or 9th that week.
So who is up for this challenge?
Yes, so you can think about it as you watch. With that, I'll let Ms. Ramos go through a brief overview.
That puts a lot of pressure on this presentation. Good evening again. I'm here to talk about the cost of service analysis that we did for planning services. And what we wanted to do tonight was kind of just go over what are the goals and objectives of a cost of service study, specifically what is a user fee study, overview the results of that, and then outline some options for increasing cost recovery. So overall, what we wanted to do was a cost of service specifically for planning related fees. So any application or permit that would come through the planning department. So we're not looking at anything that planning might review as part of public works or as part of building, but strictly things that are where the process kind of starts or is majority planning related. So we wanted to look at it. Were there ways that we could streamline the fee schedule? Can we collapse categories? Are there things that we don't do anymore that we can get rid of? Taking a look at that, documenting and defining the service levels. What do we mean when we say this particular application? Who does it go to? Where does it go? Does it go to Planning Commission? Is it an administrative review? Can we just kind of stamp it over the counter? What's the process associated with that? And most importantly, ensuring compliance with local and state laws, specifically Prop 218 and 26. And then ultimately, at the end of this, much like with the cost allocation plan, to provide staff with the tools needed to update these assumptions. Because again, we're taking a snapshot in time. And so if we want to keep looking at that and keep updating that snapshot, we need to be able to provide staff with those tools so that they can do that going forward. So a user fee study, it documents fee-related services and service level assumptions, and it details the full cost associated with providing a permit. Like I said, the benefits and uses, it ensures compliance with state and local laws. Currently, it says you can't charge more for a service than it costs you to provide it. Otherwise, it's a tax. So we want to make sure that what we're charging is not more than what it's costing us to provide that service. It identifies the full cost associated with providing that service. So not just salary and benefits, but also overhead. What is the full cost of providing that service? And again, it can help streamline the fee schedule. These processes where you're working back and forth with staff, this is the opportunity to make the little tweaks, even if it's just changing the name of a permit, if you will, to make those changes so that it's better reflective of what you're providing. It's easier for applicants that come to the counter to understand what their fees or their permits might be, as well as for staff to administer those fees. So the overall process that we went through, we cataloged existing and potential fees for service. We established time estimates by position for each of the services provided. We allocated overhead costs across all fee and non-fee services. We analyzed and discussed the gaps between cost and revenue. And then we started to discuss cost recovery levels and goals. So going into a little bit more detail of this, when we were establishing time estimates, we were looking for how long does it take in each step of the process, because again, right now we don't have time tracking. So I can't tell you that it takes me this much time on average to do things like this, because this was not a time and motion study. This wasn't somewhere where we sat next to staff with a stopwatch and looked at each particular permit type and how long it would take. But as part of that process, then what we do is we break it down into steps, and we say, okay, if we look at intake and processing, what are the things that we're going through? So we have to check the application, make sure it's complete. We have to enter it into the system. We have to route it to various different places, different planners, maybe different departments for them to review it. We do that initial review, we provide comments, we give it back to the applicant, we go through this process, and then ultimately we issue a permit or we approve an application. So breaking it down at that process and saying how long does it take? And so part of that, what we did is we looked at who should be providing this service. So which staff members are most likely to provide that particular service for that particular application. So is this something that is more administrative? We could do it with as an example, with a junior planner. Then we would use the junior planner time estimate or time for that, as opposed to putting it on the senior planner who would have a higher rate. We also wanted to look at desired service levels. So, to make sure if we're reviewing plans 3 times, and that's pretty standard, it's pretty common, then we want to factor in 3 reviews with plan reviews. We also wanted to, when we get these time estimates, we want to make sure that we're not pegging those at extraordinarily complex or extraordinarily simple projects. So we didn't want to take a look and say, well, I can do this in 2 hours. Because that's the fastest I can get it done. But we also didn't want to say, well, applicant X always comes in and it always takes me 5 times, so we're going to peg it at 10 hours. What we wanted to do was say for each particular permit type, on average, what are you seeing? How long is it taking you to provide that service? And that's where we wanted to peg those time estimates. So the next component was determining the total cost of providing that service. And so the various different components that get you to total cost are the direct costs. So that's the staff who are actually shepherding this process through and making the reviews and the comments. Looking at the departmental overhead. So staff like admin assistants, permit techs, the director, those who are providing support and who are not necessarily hands-on directly involved, but who are there at the counter answering questions, answering phones, providing support to the staff who are providing that service primarily. And then we accounted for citywide overhead, so taking a look at your time, clerk time, city manager time in supporting that process as it relates to planning services. So for example, if a big project comes through to council, has to be approved, or it goes to planning commission, we want to make sure that we account for that time and that cost. And so when we add all of that up together, then we get the total cost of providing the service. So for purposes of this study, we used FY18 budget, because we now have an adopted budget, so we were looking at FY18 costs, salary costs, and the citywide cost allocation plan. We took the numbers from that was just created. So when we look at fee-related planning costs, so time and costs associated with actually providing support on these permits, and looking at the projected revenue associated with that workload volume, there's about a $550,000 deficit associated with those services. So right now, the planning department is dramatically under-recovering for the services that it's providing. The current cost recovery right now is at about 13%. On average, what we typically see is between 50 and 80% cost recovery for planning. So there's a big gap that needs to be overcome in some way, shape, or form. And so one of the things that we talked with staff about were there are a couple of options for increasing cost recovery. One option is to convert certain fees or permits to cost recovery or deposit-based, wherein you set a deposit amount, and you charge against that, and if you don't quite reach the deposit amount, then you give money back. If you go over that amount, then you're requesting more money. Another option is to develop cost recovery policies and procedures. So to really formally outline what do we want our cost recovery goals to be and how do we want to achieve them. So right now, we're at about 13% cost recovery. Let's say we want to get to 50% cost recovery. And working with how do we want to get there? Do we want to get there right away, year one, or do we want to take some time and phase it in so that we don't impact the community as much? The other thing is once we have these policies and procedures in place and this idea of where we want to be, then taking a look at the flat fees, wherein we're just charging a single fee, so not taking a deposit, and look at how we can get those fees to be in line with our policies and the goals that we have. So when we talk about converting to deposit-based fees, it allows for full cost recovery. And what we want to do is we want to look at the types of permits or processes that are really extensive. They span months, if not years. They take multiple departments' time and cost that goes into that. And those are the ones that are best suited to be deposit-based. That, like I said, they're oftentimes much larger projects. So this isn't generally affecting the more mom and pop type things. These are the big developments that are coming in that want to, that want these services and want these changes. Ideally, what happens is, like I said, an initial deposit is taken when the application is submitted, and then staff will bill against that. One of the things that we have put together is we've outlined things that should be done, procedures that should be done should we move to a deposit-based fee system. Things like tracking time for these projects, monthly invoicing for the projects, so that there is an accounting for what was spent on that for that deposit. Also setting limits for once a deposit gets down to a certain level, looking at what do you want your policy to be? Do you just let it go all the way down? Do you say once we get to a minimum of X amount, then we'll stop work until we replenish that? The idea again here is that you get total cost recovery, that you refund anything over what you took, and that you ask for more to meet what your actual service level was for those particular fees. In order to implement that, we would suggest that you establish what those policies and procedures are to go along with that. And like I said, we've already kind of laid those out. So we'd be able to work with staff as well as council to establish what those need to be in order for these deposit-based fees to go into effect. So this is a table showing which fees are being proposed to move to a deposit base. Like I said, a lot of these are fairly large project types in nature, especially when you talk about rezoning or general plan amendments, parcel maps, subdivision maps. Again, these are big projects where they can span multiple months. They can take a lot of different support depending on the type of project that it is, and a lot of these are unique in nature. Some of them can be a lot simpler than others. And what we did here with the recommended deposit was we took an estimate from staff of looking about how much time they think they would spend on that. And then looked at establishing a deposit based on that so that we could have some area to start with. And obviously all of these are just recommended by us. Obviously staff and council can set those deposits at whatever level they might like, because again, the idea is that you refund anything that you don't use. So the next kind of option is to look at establishing policies and annual updates. So the city, for every department, but since we're here specifically talking about planning, the city should develop a cost recovery policy, something that guides overall what we want cost recovery for planning to be. And that doesn't mean that every single fee in the on the fee schedule meets that policy or that goal, but that we have a general driving idea for where we want to be. They should, like I said, they should represent the baseline for the department. You can go on a fee-by-fee basis and say, I want this to be at 50%, this to be at 30%, this to be at 70%. Or you can kind of give an overarching goal for it and then note certain exceptions, because you can always charge less than it's costing you to provide that service. But we would recommend that you outline why it is that you are going to do that, because a lot of times what happens is we make these policies because we are trying to encourage certain actions in certain areas, and then they just continue on. And in perpetuity. And so what we want to do is make sure that we document those so that somebody can come back later on and say, we no longer need this policy, it's no longer needed, and you'll be able to take it off, as opposed to getting, 5-10 years down the line and everybody going, I don't know why it's at this percentage, but it's just at this percentage. So really kind of documenting what those goals are, what those policies are. Also taking a look at establishing an annual fee increase mechanism. So doing something like a fee study every year is not common. It's usually recommended that you do it every 3 to 5 years. But if we're trying to maintain cost recovery, then ideally what you would do is set a mechanism by which you would increase your fees annually. We recommend using like a COLA or a labor increase. Some cities you could use a CPI, but at least that way what you do is you increase your fees so that minimally all you're doing is maintaining your cost recovery level. Because if you keep your fees the same over the course of 3 to 5 years, you're actually going to end up losing money nominally, because your costs will increase but your fees will stay the same. So looking at establishing and setting a mechanism by which you can increase your fees annually to account for that, to at least maintain whatever level that you set at. And then finally, looking at adjusting the flat fees. So once you've developed a cost recovery policy or goal, looking at how you can and where you want to increase flat fees to increase cost recovery. So you can make one-time increases where, if your current fee is $100 and your full cost is $1,000, you could make a one-time increase and you could go immediately to the $1,000, let's say. The other thing you could look at doing is phasing it in. Maybe we want to get to full cost recovery, but we think it's a bit too much to go year one. So looking at phasing it in. Do you do it over 2 years or 3 years or 4 years so that you've scheduled those increases so that you get closer and closer to cost recovery? And what we would want to do is work with staff to look at where's the volume, where's the workload associated with these permits, and take a look at how the impacts of increasing fees would actually impact the community, so that we can make the best decisions to increase cost recovery, but have the least impact that we could have. And I'm done.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'll yield to the council.
I had a question on the appeal fee. Could we go back to the where it shows all the fees?
Missed it. There we go.
Is it common, like if there's an appeal and depending on which way it goes, that there's maybe a percentage of it goes back, or is in the cost recovery normally just where it's the $10,000 or it's $10,000 and that's it? If you win the appeal, if it gets denied, is there cities that will give a little bit of that back?
I've seen it done a lot of different ways. So there are some cities that will make it a flat fee. You just pay X, and you can appeal. There are other cities that do it deposit based. But what you do after that is more of a policy. So there are some cities that do have policies that say if you win your appeal, and that they will refund the fee, because the thought process being that there is merit behind that and that it should have been approved or it should have been denied for whatever reason. So that's a council policy or a jurisdictional policy that can be put in place for that. And it can be anything from the full refund to a percentage of it.
Gary?
So what I see here is that we're talking about staff charging $10,000. So somebody pays $400 to appeal something, and then staff's going to say, all right, developer, I need another 10 grand from you. And that seems a little bit strange to me. Because then it'd be a tactic for competitive developer or whatever. I'm just going to appeal and then cost you 10 grand. And then I look at all these numbers and looking at the lots and the potential development we have in town, and we're talking about affordable housing. It just puts it out even further. Just looking at the base numbers here, just puts affordable housing out just that much further, in my assessment. So what are you seeing in other cities? We're talking about cost recovery, but we've been operating with our planning department for 30 years. It doesn't add up to me.
So what we say, so let me start with the appeals. So the appeal fee is usually, it's charged to the person who is doing the appealing. So it's not the.
I totally
okay.
understand that, yeah.
Okay.
But you're talking about an appeal here, so you're saying that if somebody, I want to file appeal against Kathy, that she's going to build something, the new appeal fee you're suggesting is $10,000 now?
It's a deposit of $10,000, and again, it's the
It's $400, sir.
So here, let me back up a sec. So what this shows here is if you were doing 100% cost recovery, these are some of the deposits that you would, kind of the deposits you would charge. Because appeals, as we all know, appeals are expensive in terms of staff time to prepare, to review, to do the analysis, bringing things forward. So I will tell you, easily the appeals we've had to date have cost, in terms of staff time, legal time, more than $10,000 per appeal. Now, this will be a conversation that council, when we come back, you'll definitely want you to talk through. I think there's potentially two different things. There is the appeal fee that the applicant pays, which in most jurisdictions is $400 to $500, $800, $1,000. It is a fairly nominal amount because most agencies want kind of an easy door to open for someone to potentially appeal an item against, sometimes with a developer who's got more money. So that kind of typically have a low threshold. Now, in most cities, the developer pays for the cost of the appeal, and the city costs are charged to that developer. That's the way it works in most cities. I guess this will be a conversation that, not expecting to, this isn't kind of a recommendation. These are, if you're going to do 100% cost recovery, these are some of the proposed, and we've gone through and kind of looked at pieces of these. I think the other piece, though, going to your question, Gary, is, we've operated for a long time without these cost recoveries, and this community has. But the reality is, what that means is when developers come here, they are able to pay a much lower cost to develop a project than they are in most other communities that they're going to. In Sonoma County, every other community in Sonoma County has got some form of cost recovery at a higher level.
I totally understand it, but we haven't developed anything in a long time in this town.
Well, there are projects moving forward the pipeline that are taking staff time. I think part of the concept here on cost recovery is, it goes back to, if you look at this at the highest level, the reason you do cost recovery and that you have fees is because there's a direct benefit coming to an individual and they should pay a fee for that direct service, versus the tax is a general service provided to anyone and there's not a direct benefit. So those two differences, we provide police protection. We're not charging a fee. It's a general service we provide to everyone, and taxes provide that. Here, when we're talking cost recovery, you have an individual who wants to put an ADU in. You have an individual that wants to add a new fence, or they want to split a lot, or they want to develop a property and put in 4 or 10 or 20 houses. They are going to receive a direct benefit, and so therefore the general fund shouldn't be subsidizing that. And right now, general fund and taxpayers are subsidizing developers. Finding that sweet spot is part of, there's a sweet spot here, and we're not going to go from kind of doing nothing to all of a sudden here. But staff's perspective and my recommendation is we need to be doing greater cost recovery because we need to be providing some additional staff resources so we can move some of these projects through. And again, as you heard the consultant say, generally in the world of planning, it's 50 to 70% cost recovery. We're sitting at about 13%. So we're at a place where, again, where we end up and how quickly we move there is a question, but that's why we brought this forward. And, again, we're not making these decisions tonight. I'd like to have a council subcommittee to chew through, because when you look at every fee, there's nuance. There's things to think about here. And we do have, Courtney and her team have gotten some information about fees from some of the other Sonoma County agencies that will be helpful to look at as well.
If I could just add a little bit. First, just in terms of implementation, how it all plays out moving forward, there's going to be there are a variety of different ways to approach things like an appeal fee. For example, we have, I don't know, within the last 2 years, the council reviewed an appeal of a gate and an appeal of a duplex. And those are not complicated, time-consuming appeals, and they didn't involve a lot of extensive legal analysis. And, you know, under cost recovery, they would not be that expensive, and they wouldn't necessitate a $10,000 deposit. So just as we have now, you know, a different fee structure for a project involving an environmental review, the fee structure for an appeal might be tied to the level of complexity or the type of the application, because that is where the time comes in. Typically, it does involve it's associated with projects in particular that involve environmental review that we see, you know, this greater amount of time being spent. Second, just overall, we certainly operated without cost recovery for many years, but at least from my perspective, we're in a different environment today in terms of community expectations and in terms of how the law works. So, for example, under, you know, new housing laws, we need to move much more quickly on the processing of applications for housing developments than we've been required to do in the past. That takes staff capacity. One of the reasons why we're bringing this forward is because we need additional staff capacity to do a better job moving things forward in a timely manner. And that is something that benefits not just the developer, it benefits the public. When we have projects that linger for too long because we're stretched working on a variety of projects, that just doesn't really work well for anybody. So that's one of the reasons why we're here, and it's as much of it, while it may be on the face of it a hit to the development community in terms of paying these extra dollars, there is also a direct benefit that we want to provide in terms of increased resources and quicker, more effective processing.
Are there any questions? David, did I? No. So that's interesting. You took my question. I want to know if you compared to other cities. Are there a lot of, I mean, we're very different from San Francisco. Do you know what I'm saying? So how do you determine how you compare? Is it population or?
So one of the things that we did is we looked at who you guys compare yourself to. So we have Lake Petaluma and Cotati, and so other local jurisdictions to that. But one of the other things that we also do in looking at that is it's not a fair comparison to say, you know, Cotati charges $200 for a conditional use permit, and we charge $300 for a conditional use permit. And part of that is because different cities have different cost recovery levels. Mm-hmm. Different cities have taken longer to increase their fees and haven't had cost studies done potentially as recently as you have. And so we've collected that information to kind of help clarify the picture, if you will. Because, for example, if somebody is a lot lower than you, but they haven't increased their fees in 10 years, to sit there and look at it just from that perspective and say, gosh, why do we cost so much more? It's probably not that you cost so much more, it's that they're choosing to charge less. And you always have the option to not charge 100% cost recovery. That can absolutely be your prerogative. And so to the extent that you have that information and that we're able to provide that information to you for the comparison, I think that'll help. But there are other jurisdictions that do charge deposit-based fees. I think Cotati, if I remember correctly, I think most of their fees actually are deposit-based. So it's looking at differing levels in the way that different jurisdictions do it, and they all have differing reasons for why they do it.
Are you suggesting that we have a policy for the cost recovery? Is that a suggestion?
Yes. So our suggestion would be, for example,
well,
to say,
them here, so.
Well, not so much for the deposit amounts, but to say that, you know, we think that planning should be at 50% cost recovery, as an example, and that's kind of the overall guiding. And that's not to say that every fee is at 50%, because you would ideally have some that are deposit-based that'll be 100%, but that overall, when you kind of true up at the end of the year, that you're roughly at about 50, that you're recovering about 50% of your costs.
So one of the things I've seen here is that with respect to appeals, they're $420, is that right? Something, $450?
I think they're 400.
So it's appealed, and we're going through all that staff time, and there isn't anything to draw down from to have that recovery. So yeah, I think this makes sense. It's like we have to grow up here. There are a lot of things we're growing up about, so I appreciate this analysis.
Since I'm still here, I'm a little surprised that we're only recovering 13%. I think we're all probably a little surprised at that. I appreciate the concerns about how this could become a barrier to the kind of development that we need. I think it's important to keep appeals as a very separate type of service that this group provides. The major service is the support of the development process, and the appeal shouldn't happen all the time, and we shouldn't create incentives for it to happen all the time. But oftentimes it's people who represent the character of Sonoma who bring an appeal, and we need to appreciate that. So I can imagine a cost recovery policy that had a very different percentage for appeals versus the other types of fees. So I look forward to recovering a larger share of the cost of operating our government. So thank you.
Thank you. Oops, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Conlon.
I too would agree that I'm surprised that we aren't recovering a lot more than 13%. We live in a world under Prop 26. I don't want to pay, with my water rates for having streets paved or, lights on in buildings somewhere that don't really relate to my water bill, nor do I want, other taxes going to subsidize people that are getting some direct benefit that I might not have any access to. But I do agree the appeal, and it just doesn't seem right. I mean, that's access to our government. That's a big barrier to people that may just be interested in the qualitative characteristics of their neighborhood, and just want to, voice that, and they're not getting that chance. And certainly putting something like $10,000 on an appeal will keep them from voicing that. So I hope you would consider doing something other than that, and keeping that much more reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask a question again? Have you seen cities with a different scale for appeals? Because that's what ours is very low for appeals, and I think Vice Mayor Harrington basically said so far there have not been frivolous ones, so they're based,
Can I just clarify something? We're talking about fees that developers pay right now. So we're not talking about fees the public pays. So the $10,000 for the developer, correct? Yes.
Depends on who is appealing, but yeah.
No, I'm talking about in the slide in front of us, this is about fees that developers would pay. Everyone is confusing that with fees the public pay. But the $10,000 is how much they're saying the cost is, but we're talking about charging developers, not the public.
Yes.
Yes. This is not, again, the applicant fee. This is the cost that, again, not a small appeal. It's not, not a gate appeal, but a more typical appeal of a larger project that's got environmental review. The time estimate that staff put together it's about $10,000. And so typically agencies, those charges are charged to developers. Again, if you wanted to split that 50-50, the city pays half, developers half, those are policy options. But there is a cost that currently is being covered by basically the general fund.
So if it's a wealthy architect or a group of architects, wealthy architects don't like another group of wealthy architects, and they want to appeal their projects, one still pays 400 and the other one pays 10 grand, basically.
Correct.
Think of it this way, 100% of people can sue anyone in the state of California, and it costs $435. And after that, you're going to have to hire a lawyer, and you may be right, and you may be wrong, and you're going to spend thousands of dollars, but I absolutely have the right to sue anybody I want on any cause of action, as do you. And those are the fees for the gateway to having a democratic process of having it reviewed. That's what we have.
I was just going to say, to your point, though, you can set tiered appeal fees. You could set tiered fees for just about anything if you wanted to, if that was your prerogative.
That's what Mr. Conlon was saying.
I just can't see how it's right where one person can have to put up 10 grand, and you know, especially when we hold things up for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and the cost of money, et cetera, et cetera. I guess it's maybe I don't get it.
So this is a conversation that you're not making a policy call on tonight. None of this you're making a policy call. The purpose of this slide really was to show you if you're doing basically trying to recover 100% of where you would do deposits, this is what it looks like. And what we would like to do is have an ad hoc council committee to work with us so that we can then bring back the more detailed fee analysis.
I don't believe we have any other questions at this time, so I'm going to close the public session, and I'll bring it back to the council.
I think this is all really interesting to think about. I can see how 100% would not play well in Sonoma. On the other hand, though, you know, some of our bigger projects, I think some of the developers would support paying for an appeal if it meant that it was faster. Like if they could get an answer in a few months rather than, you know, 2 years down the road. So I think there's a balance here, and I think that, you know, sort of the theme for today is, you know, us as a city getting a little more sophisticated with the way that we do things because the world is getting more complicated and our procedures need to reflect this. So I think that, and there's a lot of adjustments here. And so this is like, you can link things like what do you want people to be building, and you can, you know, drastically reduce those fees. Like, well, what are you tired of people building? Like, you can make them cover their own costs and not subsidize them like we have been. So I think this is all moving in the right direction. I think there's a lot to talk about, and I would be happy to be on the subcommittee to talk about it.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to? So I think so Rachel has volunteered, and is there anyone else interested in volunteering for this?
You know, I'll go ahead and throw my my hat into it. But I do want the mayor to know that all we're discussing right now is we've got to this point for the cost recovery. Now we're going to go back with the ad hoc committee. I guess it would be Councilmember Hundley and myself, and then we'll be coming back to the council on some of our recommendations.
Right. So we're not looking for a motion or anything, you're just, okay.
Nope, just
Thank
need the
you.
appointment of the subcommittee, and so we look forward to working with Councilmember Hundley and Councilmember Cook.
Thank you, and there'll be a big bonus for you two at the end of this, so thank you so much. All that big money that this council makes, that's what I heard out there. Okay. Good night.
We have one last item, or two last items, sorry.
Discussion, consideration, and possible action regarding designation of the City of Sonoma voting delegate for the 2018 League of California Cities Annual Conference.
So is council aware the conference this year in September is down in Southern California. They always have items to have cities vote on. Typically I think it's the Friday, And so at this point, I believe Mayor Agramonte is attending, and I don't believe anyone else is attending. I guess the
Bloodbath trying to choose the person.
So I guess the question, but if council would like to have, but if you'd like to participate, you do need to select a delegate, and we need to turn something in.
Okay. Sorry, I'm opening up this to the public. Oh boy, I can't believe it. All right, so I'm closing the session, public session, and I'm bringing it back to council.
Great. I hope Madeline Agramonte is willing to serve as our voting delegate for the 2018 League of California Cities Annual Conference.
I'm going to wear my Team Sonoma hat.
And if it's anything like last year, it's not that long, but a little bit crazy.
Oh, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh, okay.
Shouting. It's great.
Great. So that's all you need? Do
So
we have
that
to
was
vote?
a second for
I guess
Rachel.
we have to vote.
We need to vote.
So
Thank
was
you.
that a motion?
It was an implicit second that I
And a second. Did we hear a second? Yes. Okay, we have a second from
Councilmember
Mrs.
Cook?
Lee.
No. Aye.
Councilmember Hundley?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
The motion carries 4-1. 5 to unanimously.
Oh, sorry. You can tell I'm anxious.
6.4, discussion and direction on council goals, process, and draft key initiatives, including the appointment of ad hoc council subcommittees to assist in further scoping and refinement.
Great, Mayor Agramonte and council members. So if you remember, we met in May and had a good about 3-hour session talking about council goals, picking this back up again. There were a variety of things that were talked about during that time. And at the end, there were a number of items where there was kind of consensus on, and what I am labeling key initiatives. We also, and they are listed here on the front of your staff report, and were also talked about as part of the budget process. These are, in my mind, these are key initiatives. They are part of council goals, but they're not the only council goals. We talked about still having general goals similar to what the city has had for some time. That would be more general in nature, a fiscal responsibility goal, a community quality of life and infrastructure goal, a water goal, and there would be some other initiatives that the council wants us to accomplish over the next 2 years. That is not all here right now, but what we committed to is coming back with kind of really what I'm calling draft work plans. They're very much draft, their scope, so that there's a starting point for the ad hoc committees to work from. And again, we can continue to refine this and polish, and then as we come back together. So the interest, my desire tonight is to have you look, if you look on page 3, kind of the orange piece in your packet, there is a list of what the key initiatives are and a couple of major contracts. I'm looking for council ad hoc committees to be assigned to in the places where we've recommended. There's some places I think the actions are better having the full council review and talk through. If council feels differently, obviously that is your prerogative. But there basically are 6 different subcommittees that I would like you to appoint. I'm looking for an ad hoc committee to work for probably the next 9 months to a year on the Broadway streetscape enhancements and traffic circulation. Another committee to work on the Plaza Depot Park enhancement and connectivity project. Another committee to work on housing opportunities, cemetery assessment and strategy, communication, collaboration, coordination, and then another 2 folks to work with the law enforcement contract, which is up the end of June 2019. And so I thought maybe a way to do this would be maybe have just each of you express what your interest is before kind of just starting top down, and then we can see maybe where there is some agreement and hopefully come to a place that you all are comfortable and are able to work on some of the things you're interested in. But we should do public comment before you make those appointments, but if there's any questions council has, I'm happy to answer questions.
Are there any questions at this point? No? Okay, I'm taking it out to the public. Oh my gosh, no one coming to podium, and so I turn it over to the council. I think, did we discuss general plan? Should be the whole council.
Yeah, there's places that I didn't, I believe like the downtown parking strategic plan and the general plan update should be kind of full council. In addition, like Visitors Bureau contract, labor negotiation, those are full council. We already have a homelessness subcommittee with Mayor Agramonte and Councilmember Hundley is already appointed, so.
So that's us for the housing? Is that what
No,
you're saying?
that homelessness. We've already made that ad hoc appointment to work on that contract for the year. Yourself and Councilmember Hundley's already been made. So I guess the pleasure of the mayor, but maybe if Councilmember Cook could just say which ones he's interested in, and then we'll see if there's some alignment.
Yeah, I can mention my two, but I want my colleagues to know that, you know, I would like to be the cemetery, be one on the cemetery, and I'd also like to be with the contract for the sheriff's department.
I would like to work on the Broadway streetscape, the Plaza and Depot Park, and housing.
Amy, what? Oh, Broadway? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, who's next? You. Well, I know cemetery because I just love working with Mr. Cook, even though we haven't seen each other. We actually had our committee shut down at one point, so I would love to work again. We were basically not, I'm sorry, before your time, we were sort of told, go away, and the housing opportunities. Oh, and Rachel.
Rachel, can you use your microphone? Sorry, we're having trouble hearing you. Thank you.
I forgot. All right. I said I would be interested in doing the Broadway streetscape, although I would be okay if Councilmember Edwards was interested in that one. I would really like to do housing. As far as the other ones, the sheriff's contract is something I'm interested in, and I guess that's it. I don't really understand what the communication, collaboration, coordination is, or where that one came from.
Sorry, this was an area of looking at how do we do some enhanced both training for staff for presentations, maybe communication, also communication, public engagement, what are some best practices, look at some of that. So I think this one potentially has a little smaller scope initially, potentially, than some of the rest, but it all depends on how it all comes together. Gary?
So the law enforcement contract I'm interested in, Plaza and Depot Park, and I'm going to work on housing anyway. But I'd be happy to work on the communication and collaboration and coordination piece if nobody else is doing that. But I would do Broadway too. It's kind of whatever.
Okay, so it looks like in terms of the cemetery, it sounds like that's an easy one, that David and Madeline, and so we'll go back all the way through these, but is council comfortable having, okay, so that one we will call done. Then the other place that there were two folks, which was on the Plaza and Depot enhancement and connectivity, and we had Amy and Gary there. Do we want to look at that as well? Agreement there? Okay. So now, and then we've got on the communication collaboration, maybe let's come back to that. We just have Gary there. Then the other ones, we have three folks. So you all can talk amongst yourselves. We can do votes. So I have on Broadway, we have Amy, Rachel, and Gary. And then the housing opportunity, we've got Amy, Madeline, and Rachel. And then the law enforcement contract, we have David, Rachel, and Gary.
Well, housing is what I'm most interested in, so I would be happy to allow my colleagues to talk about Broadway and traffic in my stead.
Okay, so I hear Rachel stepping off the Broadway then, and wanting to retain on housing, but.
I just did housing because I was on it before, but Madeline can do it if she wants. It's fine.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so then we'll pull Amy off, and so then I'm looking at Broadway Streetscape with Amy and Gary. We're looking at housing opportunities with Madeline and Rachel. And then going back down to the law enforcement contract is the other, where there were 3 of you that had an interest, and we have David, Rachel, and Gary on that one.
Who's on, what is, I'm sorry, communication again?
Communication was, I think Vice Mayor Harrington talked about this. This was looking at, one, how do we improve presentations from staff? I think it's also, what are different public engagement techniques to look at how do we include the public? And part of this, frankly, is including them sooner in the process as we do some of our work. And then also, I think, we have these tools and looking at, some of our different communication and how can we've got tools now, how do we can just enhance maybe the communication we're doing with
And
them.
how many were there in that one?
I just have Gary there currently.
If you need to, I'm happy to do it. I'm interested in it, but I don't know. It seems like it's going to be mostly a staff question.
I think it might be good to have maybe I think this one is of shorter duration than some of the rest of these that are far broader in scope. I would appreciate an opportunity to talk with 2 council members. There are some research and ideas that we've put together, but I don't think this has to be a long one.
Okay. And for the police contract, my 2 associates really want that one, then I would be happy to step down from that one. Police contract.
So we've got, David and Gary? Okay.
That makes sense since you're on that hiring.
Okay. So let me just repeat, and then we can take a motion to approve them all. Does this make sense to? All right, so we'll do Broadway Streetscape.
Who seconded? Did anybody second?
Second.
All right. Roll call, please.
You're clear about who's on what?
Yes.
Okay.
Councilmember Cook?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Harrington?
Aye.
Councilmember Edwards?
Yes.
Mayor Agramonte? Mayor Agramonte?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries unanimously.
How about council member reports? Anybody?
I just want to report out really quick. We had a JSA this morning, or this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Apologize, I had to close session, so I was only there for half of it. The main thing, and I'll be coming to the council probably within the next month, because the jurisdiction is part of it, and the fees, we'll be trying to decide if our jurisdiction will continue paying, or if we'll be trying to find some kind of a way of having the community pay for it. But it looks like the consensus is going to be each jurisdiction, but I will come back for the vote on that.
Thank you. Gary? Rachel? Amy?
No.
Okay. Nothing from me. So now we.
So Mayor Gramonte, sorry.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you to the council. It has been a very busy year, very busy last 2 or 3 months, and in particular 3 meetings in the last week. So I want to thank you for your time and focus and work. I also really want to thank staff, those that are here and those that aren't with us tonight, but there's been a huge amount of work.
But especially those that are here.
Well, the good news is Kathy's going on vacation, right?
I am.
Hooray!
So anyway, it takes a team, and I believe this the amount of work we've all done reflects the team we have. So thank you very much.
Well, there's nothing else to discuss. We're adjourning.